Chapter 304. Lionel didn't regret his actions earlier. His regret had become a recurring event with him. He would make a mistake, acknowledge it, then move on. Over time he wouldn't make the same mistake again, but that wouldn't stop him from making more and continuing to regret them. For all intents and purposes, this was another mistake. Lionel didn't consider the fact his soul force could ever run out. This was only natural. He had become so used to using his soul force with impunity, he didn't even think reaching his limit was possible. It seemed impossible to him. After all, he had a mind with the capacity of a fifth-dimensional entity even if he was lacking in the power. Running out of strength while battling within the third dimension would seem ridiculous to anyone. However, this was the reality before Lionel. Yet, he didn't regret it. In fact, it was something that filled his heart with anticipation and fervor. The power his dreamscape battle sense ability gave him was something he could have never imagined. He toyed with the lives of two demon lords. Even if it was Lamorak before him, he would have been able to force the Knight of the Round Table into a corner as well. Lionel was certain of this. It was a power he created himself. It wasn't something he was born with like his metal synergy or his spear domain lineage factor. He had built it with his own two hands. There was something about this that filled him with pride. He had earned it. It was his. Whatever consequences might come with it, he would take. And why not? It was his. Maybe the reason Lionel felt this way was because these emotions were in such sharp contrast to his shame. These thoughts had been floating within Lionel's mind for so long already. How many times had he been lucky to survive? Lionel still remembered the conversation he had had with Roaring Black Lion within the Hive Cave. He might have had very few interactions with Roaring Black Lion, but that one in particular resonated with Lionel. The new world older seemed to make the pains of the past worse. The bat of human nature seemed to have been peeled back like a festering wound, open to being damaged more and more with every passing moment. Lionel realized how lucky he was to be in his position. Whether it be the talent passed down to him by his parents or the odd twists of fate that had allowed him to keep his life until now. His dreamscape battle sense was one of the first things that wasn't just luck. Sure, his ability was gifted to him, but how he used it was built with his own hands. That budding feeling within his chest seemed to grow. With every strike Lamorak landed on him, these thoughts only reaffirmed themselves. This pain that he was suffering now? Was it worth it? Bang. Was it still worth it now? Bang. How about now? Were you still proud? Did you still hold your head high? Are you not willing to beg for mercy yet? Bang. It was a repetitive cycle. The whistling wind, Lamorak's roar, the sound of metal meeting flesh, Big Buddha's cackling laughter, it was all imprinted within Lionel's heart. Even he didn't understand what this budding feeling was or what it represented. Maybe that was just how human nature was. People thought about inexplicable things at inexplicable moments. They felt ways they couldn't explain and ignored what might have been logical at any given instant. However, there would come a day where Lionel understood even if it wasn't now. For now though, he felt a welling sense of pride. Because at least this time he hadn't given up. Lamorak raged, his mace swinging down with everything he had. He lost himself in his emotion. He didn't hear the sound of his weapon connecting, he couldn't feel it either as his arms grew numb. He couldn't even hear the sound of Big Buddha's laughter. All he saw was Lionel's gaze. That empty, calculating gaze as his body was slowly being beaten into the ground. At that moment, a massive crater had appeared within the castle. As Lamorak pounded down, he sunk further into the crater along with Lionel, not caring for what might happen to the foundation of Camelot. By this point, many of the warriors he had been commanding had long since caught up. They watched this scene with astonished gazes, not knowing what they should be doing. But Lamorak didn't notice them either. All he saw was that gaze, those two pale green eyes. They seemed to be the only part of Lionel's body left untainted by blood. Then, he swore he saw those two eyes smile. Grand. Heal? Lionel's voice cut through the whistling wind. At that moment the situation changed. A blinding surge of light encased Lionel, repelling Lamorak back several feet. Grand heal. Lamorak didn't believe what he had just heard. In the whole of Camelot, there were only two people who could use this spell, each more respected than the last. One was Pope Margrave and the second was the man he respected the most in this entire world. King Arthur. It was a 3-star Magus art on a completely different level than minor heal. In fact, it was so difficult to cast that it was even set apart from other 3-star Magus arts. The reason this art was so difficult to cast was because not only was it a healing spell, but it was simultaneously a defense spell. Upon activation, the spell would give off a massive push force field, forcing any enemies in the vicinity back. Even Lamorak was blasted back tens of meters before he could even react. By the time he realized what was happening and charged forward again, his visage coated with a savage expression, it was already too late. Lionel slowly stood from the crater, his clothing in complete tatters. His movements were slow, yet they held an undisguised strength behind them. His sturdy, bronzed skin shone through the tears in his robes, giving him a wild, untamed appearance. In the past several months, Lionel's hair had grown uncontrollably. Plus, due to the fact it was as sturdy as thin filaments of metal now, it was simply too much of a hassle to cut. By now, it was already approaching the small of his back, completing his unrestrained look. With a flip of his palm, his bow appeared. Even without an arrow knocked, Big Buddha's laughter came to a grinding halt, and those warriors who were in the surroundings involuntarily took a step back. "I hope you had fun," Lionel said indifferently. "It's my turn now." Chapter 305. Lionel didn't wait for Lamorak's response. He had already taken a step forward and knocked his first arrow. Bronze runes lit all across his body, a halo of violet bronze hanging above his head. At the same time, a crown etched itself across his forehead, making him look no different from a holy king. This experience taught Lionel something very important. His soul force stamina wasn't just about the amount of soul force reserves he had, but also about how quickly he was able to replenish it. The slow spinning of his two stars wasn't meaningless. At all times, they were siphoning force from the surroundings and converting it into soul force for his use. The reason he had ended up in such a sorry state before was because he had used up his soul force faster than his constitution could replenish it. Once his soul force dried up, the power balance of his ethereal glabella broke, causing his stars to lose their impetus to spin. As a consequence, he needed far more soul force to allow them to begin to spin once more. However, the instant they began to move once again, Lionel didn't have to wait for the rest of his soul force to recover. He could entirely rely on his stars to replenish his spirit pressure faster than he was using it. Lionel activated Hot Streak without a second thought, firing out 5 shots before Lamorak could even understand the change to the situation. 5 mages found a bloody hole to their forehead before they registered any pain. Their dazes became dull, falling down in a heap of their own flesh. Lamorak was stunned by the sudden change before his eyes turned a furious shade of red. "Boy." Lionel's expression turned cold. "I have long since been tired of you." These were the second time Lionel spoke these words. But, compared to the first time, he meant them even more. He watched Lamorak pick himself up and charge toward him with a cold expression. As though he didn't realize the danger he was in, he continued firing. It felt as though every step forward Lamorak took, another one of his people would fall. No matter how much he raged and shouted, Lionel didn't seem to hear any of it. You monster!" Lamorak's steps had almost reached Lionel, but his spirit was tired. He hadn't held back at all while trying to kill Lionel just now. Could be said that he was already a spent force, yet Lionel was actually alive. It seemed like it was all a joke. He, a knight of the Round Table, wasn't able to kill someone who couldn't even move to defend themselves. Lionel almost laughed at Lamorak's words. "Monster? When did I ever target any humans? How many demons have I killed in comparison to humans? Now you want to surround me, prey on me, kill me, and then call me a monster when I retaliate? There was a point in time where I saw you as a rival to surmount. You have no idea how many thoughts I've spared toward you in just the last month. But you've disappointed me. I realize now that being powerful doesn't make one worthy of respect." Lionel smiled. It was a smile of relief, the kind one could only smile after a great burden had been taken from their hearts. His loss to Lamorak had been weighing on his mind for a long time. But he finally felt that weight lifted from him today. Lionel met Lamorak's gaze. He could see that the latter's gaze was still reddened to the point of irrationality. Even if he heard Lionel's words, it was unlikely that he had recognized his faults. But Lionel no longer cared. He fired a last arrow, slaughtering the last of the humans before turning his attention back toward Lamorak. However, Lionel was stunned to realize that this Grand Knight wasn't even moving toward him anymore. He looked toward Lionel like a wounded beast. Then did something that left Lionel not knowing how to feel. Lamorak stared toward Lionel with bloodshot eyes. His force surged, building up toward his head. In the next instant his head exploded. It was a level of gruesome that couldn't even be explained. Blood and brain matter fell from his headless shoulders. And not long later, his body slumped to the ground, keeling over. Lionel stared forward for a long while, not knowing what to say or do. In the end he could only shake his head and sigh. Was it something about this world that made people act like this? He really wished he could do something about it. When Lionel regained his bearings, his gaze turned cold as it swept toward the one person he had left alive, Big Buddha. By now the large man had long since stopped laughing. His gaze looked dull, he only slightly trembled when he noticed that Lionel was looking toward him. Was it worth it? Lionel asked. He didn't know why he asked. He didn't expect to get anything out of it, yet he did so anyway. Ha! Big Buddha chuckled. You're alive, how could it be? Lionel shook his head before piercing Big Buddha's throat with an arrow. He looked up toward the ceiling of the castle and sighed. At that moment, within the Merlin trial grounds, everyone was waiting silently. Those who hadn't gone had made a strategic choice. After all, not going was essentially like gaining a free 24 hours of rest. Such a break was incredibly rare during the trials. Obviously, the recovery rewards simply weren't enough, especially for those who chose to use the energy more toward cultivation rather than toward healing themselves. Like this, many kept to themselves. Some tried to pry into the segmented cube Lionel left behind, but it was too difficult to cross the void to reach it. Plus, even if they did, they thought that since Lionel dared to leave it here, it was likely something they couldn't pry into all that easily to begin with. Soon, the time limit approached and many began to go on alert again. Those who had lived through the random event should be coming back any time now. That boy, he's probably dead, right? Most were thinking along these lines. Though the choice to go wasn't made public, it was pretty obvious by those who were here. 2 top 4 demon lords had gone along with 7 other lower-ranked demon lords. On top of that, there was Lamorak who had clearly disappeared as well, and he had even taken what seemed like a small troop of humans. That boy was finished. King Arthur looked up from his meditation with indifferent eyes. He wasn't thinking about whether or not Lionel survived. This was a foregone conclusion in his mind. He was thinking about how he would get his hands on the segmented cube afterward. Unlike others, this wasn't a matter of greed for him. It was rather about the little girl. King Arthur knew Pope Margrave well, and he had information channels monitoring the church. This little girl seemed to be very important to the Pope, he just didn't know why. Since he couldn't understand, it was better that he controlled this card in his hand. As he was lost in thought, a small flash of light swept through. At that moment, dozens of pairs of eyes landed on a young man who appeared with an indifferent expression, his clothes ripped and covered with blood. He held his bow in his hand and swept an unperturbed gaze over those stunned gazes. Lionel had returned. Chapter 306. Hearing the rewards Lionel was given, everyone who had been looking toward him in shock suddenly went green with envy. They had all been here when the Merlin trial moderator had said that Lionel could stand to receive 10 times the rewards should he succeed in passing this random event. However, seeing it displayed before them now made them feel as though their innards were being twisted with countless little blades. So what if the reward had a multiplier to it? In order to benefit, Lionel would have had to survive, and none of them believed that he would do so. Yet, not only had he survived, but he had only returned with barely over half a dozen people. Of the over 40 that went, so little actually returned. King Arthur abruptly stood, his gaze turning red as he looked toward Lionel. No matter how he swept his gaze, no matter how many times he double and triple checked, Lamorak was gone. His brother-in-arms for so many years, one of the 12 men he trusted his whole life to, gone. He didn't fall during war, nor beneath a siege of demons or the hands of Modred. But he fell to the hands of a boy that didn't even have to be their enemy. King Arthur's chest heaved, but it had a slowly rhythmic beat to it. He looked like a beast suppressing his strength, using all of his will to temper down his rage as he stared daggers toward Lionel. At that moment, an unconcealed kingly might exuded from his body. It was the kind that left those who were too weak stifled. Any lesser man or woman would fall to their knees. However, everyone here was an elite of the elite. Even if they felt pressured, they could forcibly withstand it. That said, they couldn't say the same if they were the target of this pressure like Lionel was. Yet, the boy stood there and met Arthur's gaze with his own, remaining expressionless. He didn't say any words of taunting nor bravado, yet his presence alone seemed to be enough of a slap to the face. To Lionel, this was what King Arthur deserved. A pillar of blinding golden light descended upon Lionel from above. He couldn't bother to care for King Arthur's emotions anymore and could only focus on accepting this reward. Much like all his other rewards, this recovery reward had a 10 times multiplier as well. This singular reward was as good as receiving 10 perfect evaluation rewards, so Lionel would take full advantage. He circulated Merlin's meditation technique. With each rotation he felt his force and soul force become more compact and sturdy. In the past, even when he sent his internal sight into his body to monitor his nodes, he would only see faint wisps of force. It couldn't be helped. His force nodes were measured in lengths of singular cells. The fact he could sense force at all was a testament to how talented his sensory abilities were. But now, Lionel could sense a heavy flow within his body. Though it wasn't as exaggerated as turning to liquid, what it did become was a thick fog. Lionel realized that this thickening not only increased the amount of force he had, but also made it easier to control. He no longer had to rely on a faint sense of where his force was and what it was doing. It was now as bright as day to him. In addition to helping him meditate, this reward was a great help toward healing his lingering injuries. Though Grand Heal was excellent, it hadn't been able to completely solve all of Lionel's troubles. In fact, if Lionel thought about it, it actually did much more for him than he thought it would. He could only chalk it up to his snowy star owl lineage factor. This aside, this reward helped him not have to worry about hidden injuries. And, as an added surprise, Lionel realized that the injury of his body followed by the thorough healing of it actually helped the herb essence within his body to fuse with him even better. He felt that he was already faintly reaching the peak of the standard stage and might even have another breakthrough soon. Just the standard stage alone was enough for Lionel to resist Lamorak's barrage for several minutes, and that was without activating his runes. He couldn't even imagine what would happen if he broke through again. Would it even be possible for anyone within the third dimension to hurt him at all? Just a little more, just a little more. Lionel had no idea that others were looking toward him with a bit of fear in their eyes. While he was completely focused on accepting his reward and compressing his force so that he would have enough assurance to form his 10th node, others were looking at him like some sort of monster. They could all tell that Lionel was in the process of compressing his internal strength, but that was exactly what made them shudder. To receive the reward was one thing, but to be able to accept it was an entirely different matter. Was this boy's body made of metal? However, Lionel didn't know about their worries, nor would he care even if he did know. Normally, it took decades of meditation to reach Lamorak's level, not only because meditation was slow, but because it took time for the body to acclimate to thicker force. However, Lionel didn't need this acclimation time. After all, he was a scion of the metal synergy lineage factor. A violent surge of wind kicked up around Lionel as he took a deep breath and opened his eyes. For a moment, his irises seemed to shine with a bright light before dimming back down to their usual pale green. Then, without sparing those watching him a glance, he used one of his special store tickets and disappeared. Since he could hide his purchases from them, why not? It might give him a small edge for a while. After all, there was no other archer even close to his level at the moment. When Lionel entered the special store, he was faced with an immediate dilemma. He had 100,000 skill points right now, 470,000 if he converted all of his slaughter points and 570,000 if he converted all of his star points as well. The question was whether he should buy the goddess necklace he was eyeing before or not. Chapter 307. Though Lionel could be considered to be a rich man now, he knew that he had to be cautious with how he used his skill points. Another random event wasn't going to come anytime soon, especially since Lionel felt as though something was artificially accelerating these trials along. Whether it was how quickly the first elimination round came or the fact a random event was triggered at all, both were signs that these Merlin trials just might not last as long as they had in the past. All of these treasures seemed blinding to the eye, but Lionel knew well that they were practically useless to him. After he left this zone, they would all disappear. So, wasting time on them was exactly that, a waste. The only value this necklace had to him was in his dream sculpt ability. But, if he used all of these skill points, Lionel knew he would be able to unlock at least 2 of the 4 seasons. That kind of boost to his strength couldn't be looked down upon at all. This seemed like a smarter choice, but Lionel hesitated again. 370 slaughter points is so many, it would be quite literally impossible for me to gather this much again. Lionel wasn't wrong. There were only about 200 warriors that entered the trials this time around. By all logic, gathering this many again would be impossible unless another multiplier event was given. But even if that did happen, there was no guarantee that Lionel would be the one to benefit this time. He had gotten lucky this time, but that didn't mean there would be a next time. Plus, there was also the fact that Lionel couldn't run from the fact he almost died. Had he not reached the standard stage and thanks to Merlin's recovery rewards, or had Lamorak not been a blunt weapon wielder, who knew how things might have turned out? It seemed smarter to just wait. What if the exchange rate for slaughter points increased again to 10,000 to 1? If that happened, Lionel could clear his whole skill tree with ease. Lionel took a deep breath. This choice was definitely a difficult one. Lionel looked down at the napping little mink in his arms. The little guy had gained a recovery reward through him, so his situation was much better than it had been in the past. After a while, Lionel made a decision. He converted 170 of his slaughter points into skill points. Then, a menacing cold suddenly swept around Lionel and through his bones. He felt as though his whole world had been cast into an endless white filled with nothing but a chilling bite. Lionel's gaze went blank for a moment. Artistic conception. These words were whispered into his mind. The universe was filled with all sorts of beautiful mysteries. The birth of a child, the budding of a flower, the rise of the sun. If one had to describe why each one of these was beautiful, it might be difficult to do. This sort of clear but difficult to grasp, comprehend and describe beauty. This was artistic conception. When one listened to a musical score. The feelings that welled up in the heart, the emotions that preyed on our deepest desires, the lurking memories that surged up from our subconscious. This was artistic conception. This was where the strength of the universe cycles lay. Everyone could see the beauty in the seasons, but how many could capture them? How many could relay the beauty they saw to others? How many could make the 4 seasons their own? A thin layer of frost began to form around Lionel, coating his hair and his brows while even turning his lips a vague shade of blue. It was only after a long while that he awoke. But the look within his eyes seemed to have grown several levels deeper, as though there was unknown and unfathomable depths hidden within their pupils. So this is the 4 seasons realm? Lionel was shocked. It wasn't by the power, but because of just how much the 4 seasons realm reminded him of his dreamscape battle sense. It was a hard-to-describe feeling and even more difficult for Lionel to fully grasp. But he felt like there was a thin, translucent line connecting the two that he couldn't quite put his finger on. In fact, he vaguely felt that his dreamscape battle sense was even a level more powerful. If others heard Lionel's thoughts, they would think he was a madman. But this was simply how he felt. Of course, Lionel still knew that his dreamscape battle sense was lacking in many aspects. For example, the efficiency was too low, almost like a written code that used up too much of a computer's memory. An elegant piece of code and a complex one could both execute the same task, but the former would always be faster and less strenuous. Lionel felt like he was in the same situation now. His dreamscape battle sense was an excellent technique, but the organization of his skills was lacking. Due to this, it took too much of his soul force to pick out the perfect technique to respond with, and as such, it drained him too quickly. In addition to this was just reliant artistic conception. Lionel was relying on the comprehensions of someone else right now, so how could this possibly represent the true strength of the 4 seasons realm? Plus, Lionel didn't necessarily feel like he had to choose one or the other. If his dreamscape battle sense and his universe cycle comprehension could be fused into one, just what kind of monster would he become? Lionel took a deep breath and left the special store. Chapter 308. When Lionel appeared, everyone felt the change within him. They could all sense the biting wind and the chilling aura. It was as though his will was being manifested in tangible form. Those who knew what this meant looked on in shock. It was precisely because they knew exactly what they were seeing that they felt as though their understanding of the world had been turned upside down. Comprehending the 4 seasons realm was one matter, but manifesting this understanding so clearly for all to see was a completely different matter. It was easier to accomplish this when it was one's own comprehension. But, when relying on the comprehension of another, this feat became several times more difficult. The fact Lionel could do this was too confusing. Even King Arthur didn't know what exactly it meant. However, it could be said that if those of the Morales clan were present, their shock would be no less. Unfortunately, no one had the time to think about their next move. The small gray platforms began to rumble. This time Lionel was ready. As he fell toward the massive gray platform beneath him, his gaze was like lightning, seeing through the intentions of all those around him. Still, he couldn't help but smile bitterly. Only a fool wouldn't be able to tell exactly who it was had just awakened the legendary skill. Shoo! Lionel's pupils constricted. 3 arrows came at him from 3 different directions. It was as though everyone had come to a tacit understanding that he was the greatest threat. But this time there was no little Nana by his side, and the little mink was currently sleeping within the segmented cube. However, Lionel didn't panic. During the random event, Lionel had cast Grand Heal. But by all rights he shouldn't have been able to. After all, within the Merlin trials, the only skills one was allowed to use were the ones they unlocked with skill points. And since Lionel had chosen a bow as his main weapon, he obviously couldn't cast spells like those who had chosen wands. Yet he had done so anyway. The real question was, how? The answer to that was simple: his lineage factors. Just like these trials couldn't stifle his ability, it couldn't hold back his lineage factors either. In that life or death situation, Lionel realized that when he used his lineage factor as a medium, casting spells he hadn't been able to before was as easy as breathing. Lionel's lip curled, beautiful bronze runes spreading across his body. Grand Bell Construct. Force surged around Lionel as a massive illusory bell formed around him in the blink of an eye. Grand Bell Construct was one of the few 3-star Earth Magus arts that didn't rely on the earth beneath one's feet to form. It coalesced pure earth force into a transparent bell that surrounded the caster. Even though it wasn't the most powerful defensive art, its utility made it perfect for the battlefield. 3 arrows rebounded off of Lionel's Grand Bell Construct. The instant his feet landed on the ground, Lionel drew his bow in a forceful arc. In quick succession he unleashed the gold skill knuckle shot in one direction and the gold skill illusion shot in another. With a swing of his hips, his gaze locked onto the last archer. Even from so far away he could see the fear in the latter's eyes. He wasn't a demon. He was a normal human man wearing the shining armor of a knight. Knights who chose to be bowmen were rare, but they were also incredibly powerful within their class. They could be considered rare elites an army couldn't do without, aces of archery. Even as Lionel released the last arrow, he could only sigh. He didn't want to kill humans, but why did they insist on targeting him? Everyone was stunned by Lionel's sudden counterattack. They were all elites, how could they not recognize the spell Lionel had just used? In this sort of situation, Grand Bell Construct was too perfect. Not only did it provide good defense, but it also allowed Lionel's attacks to pass through from the inside completely unhindered. Though it gave up some defensive strength in order to allow this, its utility in the midst of battle was completely unmatched. However, whatever success Lionel had didn't last for long. At that moment, a towering aura shot through the skies. Even Lionel couldn't help but turn his head toward a certain direction. Despite the fact he could just as easily lock onto this person with his internal sight, it felt that it was improper of him to do so. It was no surprise to Lionel that this towering aura was coming from King Arthur. Clad in white armor fitted with roaring white tigers, his blonde hair billowed beneath his surging aura. The sword in his right hand seemed to shimmer like the brightest gold. Every step he took caused the platform to quake. With reddened eyes, he slowly walked toward Lionel. No matter who he came across chose to take a step out of his way. Not a single person seemed to want to get in his way at this very moment. The humans of Camelot looked toward Lionel with reddened eyes. Their rage could be imagined. How long had the Knights of the Round Table held up the hope of their nation? How much had they taken on their shoulders? All of them were brothers in arms. Yet, for Lamorak to fall not at the hand of a demon, but a fellow human, it ate at their hearts and organs, making them shed hot tears. In Camelot, the tears of men were rare. Maybe this was the same no matter which society it was. With rarity came a certain heaviness. It was a weight that suffocated the atmosphere, bearing down on it until even the air one breathed felt like scorching lava. As a king, Arthur couldn't shed the tears he wanted to. He put the whole of his rage into his sword, causing a sword force that could cut mountains to sing through the skies. He wanted Lionel dead. He wouldn't rest until he was. Chapter 309. Lionel calmly watched as Arthur built momentum, dispelling Grand Bell Construct. Since he wanted to fight, Lionel would fight. He felt no sadness nor any remorse. Lamorak deserved to die. Lionel took a step forward, his aura billowing upward, clashing with Arthur's. A surging violet aura stood above his head, fusing with his halo. In that moment, even King Arthur's felt stifled. In a corner of the platform, Modred watched on with twinkling eyes. Despite the fact her father was so enraged, she didn't seem to feel any sort of particular way about it. She watched on like any other normal spectator. In truth, she was the most curious about Lionel. It seemed that her favorite lover in recent months actually seemed to have quite some history with this boy. But she still couldn't understand how they were related. Though Monet tried to hide it, it was pretty obvious to Modred. This was especially so after that Big Buddha character didn't come back from the random event. Modred smiled. The contrast of her cherry lips to her pale features was especially striking. "It seems you all have forgotten about me." Her voice was especially sweet, but it was barbed with the thorns of a rose. She raised her wand, her slender fingers wrapping around it. "Darling Monet, protect me." Monet nodded, brandishing her fire-coated whip. King Arthur's expression changed. "You dare?" Modred smiled as though she hadn't heard a thing, a violent dark energy surging around her. She needed slaughter points. Why would she wait around for a stupid battle of manly pride to finish? Since King Arthur wasn't paying attention to her anymore, this was the perfect chance for her to act. Modred tapped forward with her wand. At that instant, the sphere of blackness around her shot outward like the spikes of a porcupine. Agonizing screams sounded as several warriors were torn apart. In the blink of an eye, half a dozen had fallen and over a dozen more were varying degrees of injured. King Arthur's face flushed red with rage, veins bulging out from his handsome face. Without a choice, he charged back toward Modred. If he didn't hold her back, there was no one else who could. Even the 5 remaining knights of the Round Table he had come with could only be toyed around with by her. Only Lamorak and Lancelot could last a few rounds with her, but he had frozen Lancelot out and Lamorak was dead. Unfortunately for King Arthur, there was still Monet. And since Monet had acted, Violet Rain, who had maintained a low profile all this time, could only act as well. Monet's whip seemed to cover the skies. Even from over 20 meters away, she kept King Arthur at bay under the support of Violet Rain. She's this powerful? Lionel's expression changed. He suddenly realized that Monet was no weaker than Lamorak. Most of Lamorak's strength came from his compressed force. Obviously, Monet hadn't compressed her own force as much as Lamorak had. But her ability more than made up for it. Depending on the strength of one's ability, it might not even matter whether one reached the Four Seasons realm or not. It would still be possible to display grand power beyond one's imagining. In addition, it was clear that, much like Hacker Hutch, Monet had been training in the whip since long before the metamorphosis descended. King Arthur was completely enraged. His kingly aura fluctuated wildly, his sword swinging with a mighty momentum as he tried to cross Monet's barrier. Unfortunately, it was simply too difficult. He had to separate a portion of his force to fuse with his armor and block Violet Rain's poison. He was certain that if he was given enough time, he could easily reach Modred. The issue was that he didn't have the time. When Modred acted, the whole of the gray platform descended into chaos. King Arthur had only cut the distance by half when a familiar voice sounded once again. The 100 star points above Lionel's head flickered and disappeared under the unwilling gazes of all those around him. It was obvious that this was probably a large part of the reason he was targeted at all. But the archers who had chosen to take action had clearly been too eager. What would they have done had they really managed to kill him? King Arthur's steps paused, a bubbling rage threatening to erupt from deep within him. He stared toward Modred, then looked toward the corpses of his fellow man that littered the ground. Over 200 people had entered together. But now there were just 72. Just 72 left. Of them, only 40 were humans. Unfortunately, no matter how enraged King Arthur was, things were destined to continue. The same callous voice sounded as though the deaths that had been caused by it were completely meaningless. Lionel shook his head. It was for the best that things ended this way. His mission would fail if King Arthur died, and having to fight such a powerful man while holding back would be like asking for death. Just as Lionel was about to check to see if the exchange rate for slaughter points had changed, his vision swam. At first he panicked, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't seem to keep himself awake. Soon, his panic became languidness and his vision went completely black. The only assurance he gained just before he lost consciousness was that others seemed to be falling asleep along with him. Moments later, Lionel appeared floating within a cocoon. There wasn't a shred of clothing on him and he was curled up in a fetal position. What was truly shocking, though, about his current situation was the fact he wasn't alone. There was one other cocoon right next to him. But this one held a gorgeous woman who was equally as naked. In fact, even that wasn't the truly shocking part. What would stun those watching from a third party's perspective was the fact that this woman was the demonic empress, Modred. Chapter 310. Lionel felt his vision blur. When it cleared again, he was shocked to find that he was a bird in the skies. The suddenness caught him off guard, causing him to almost plummet from the clouds entirely. After he regained his bearings and figured out how his wings seemed to work, Lionel soon realized that his eyes seemed capable of peering through everything. Whether it was seeing to the ground as though it was right before him or even seeing through the walls of tall buildings, he could do it all. In fact, he realized that if he focused, he could even filter out noise and focus on individual conversations. This must be the fourth trial? But what am I supposed to do? All of the trials up to this point had been related to battle. Lionel had been entirely prepared for another long drawn-out battle. He never expected to be thrusted into a place like this. Still, Lionel realized that he had to remain calm. To this point, the only trial the voice of the Merlin trials actually explained was the random event. Outside of this, everything else was figured out by the contestants themselves. As much as this was a trial of brawn, it was also one that tested one's observational abilities. Thinking to this point, Lionel began to focus on the task at hand. The first thing he realized after a long while was that the city he was restricted to flying above was definitely Camelot. Normally, it wouldn't take him so long to realize something like this. The reason it did this time around was because of two factors. For one, he wasn't used to seeing Camelot from such a vantage point. And secondly, this Camelot wasn't exactly like the one he had come to know. From Lionel's observations, he believed that this Camelot was displaced through time. It was either a version of the kingdom from the past or from the future. Judging by the overall smaller scope, Lionel concluded that this was more likely a Camelot of the past, probably a few decades younger than the Camelot he had come to know. Why would this trial send me to Camelot's past? Lionel's heart was a bit perturbed. He still remembered the trial he had to complete. His main trial was to save King Arthur. His two side quests were to kill Modred and resolve the love triangle. And finally, the hidden quest was to make Camelot a part of true history. At this point, with how difficult everything had become, Lionel had resigned himself to not perfectly clearing this zone. As long as he saved King Arthur, he would be able to leave here alive. However, recently, Lionel realized a problem with that line of thinking. This was an SS grade zone. This meant that the reward for clearing the main quest was a Tier 8 black treasure. However, he needed a Tier 9 black treasure in order to exchange for a ticket to another world. This realization frustrated Lionel. In order to get a reward a tier above the difficulty of the zone, he needed to complete the harder of the two side quests. But, with his current relationship with King Arthur, how the hell was he supposed to help fix his marriage? Was that a joke? This ultimately left Lionel with only one choice. Even if he failed both side quests, he needed to find a way to complete the hidden quest. Only then would he be able to exchange for what he needed. Of course, since this zone had a 12-person entry limit, it was still possible for Lionel to exchange 5 Tier 8 rewards for 1 Tier 9 reward. However, Lionel didn't want to put his hope into this. There were still Monet, Violet Rain and little Nana who remained alive. This meant that the rewards would be split between the 4 of them. In that case, even if they managed to clear the main quest, Lionel would only have 3 Tier 8 rewards, which wouldn't be enough. Of course, he thought of killing Monet and Violet Rain, but he chose against doing so. Though he had no love lost between himself and Monet, Violet Rain had never acted against him. Even if he considered the matters of the tournament, those were just minor inconveniences. She never harmed his life. He would never cross his own bottom line just for the sake of a reward. And even if he killed Monet alone, that would only give him 4 rewards to exchange. He would still fall short, so there was no need to risk himself to kill such a powerful woman. There was another matter that Lionel had been reluctant to think about. If he didn't get the ticket to Terrain, he would be in mortal danger after he left this zone. How could the Slayer Legion possibly let him off so easily? So why was Lionel thinking about all of this now? Other than the fact it was related to his life and death? It was precisely because the oddity of this trial was the first chance he saw that just might be related to his hidden quest. If he was lucky, it might even let him understand how to fix King Arthur's marriage without the need to befriend the man. Lionel realized that this trial was his chance. His gaze sharpened as he focused his everything on finding the clues he needed. Gem? Lionel's hawk eyes lit up. When observing such a large area, it was difficult to tell what was important to pay attention to. Lionel had listened in on way too many useless conversations about the weather or stumbled into some not-so-wholesome displays of affection. However, he realized that there would always be clues that pointed him toward particular main events. For example, he stumbled onto many conversations about the exploits of Lancelot. It turned out that he recently killed the Demon Emperor. Lionel wasn't sure who this Demon Emperor was, but in all likelihood he was the leader of the demons before Modred. Another hot topic he stumbled into was information about the recent closure of the Merlin trials. It appeared that Lancelot, Queen Guinevere and King Arthur were the ones who gained the most. From this, Lionel understood that this was at least 4 to 5 decades ago. The last opening of the Merlin trials was 50 or so years ago, so for it to still be such a hot topic, Lionel was sure that it ended quite recently. Still, there was one event that was spoken the most about. It overshadowed all others. The Queen was giving birth. However, there was a problem with this information that made Lionel raise an eyebrow. Leonis was in his 20s, not much older than Lionel himself. If not for this, he'd be much more powerful and would have been allowed by his father to participate. So who was the Queen giving birth to over 4 decades ago? Chapter 311. Lionel realized that this birth must be the main event of this world. So he focused in on the castle. Lionel was shocked to find that the instant he did, time accelerated around him. This is a good thing, Lionel concluded. Must mean I'm on the right track. Though time accelerated, Lionel caught everything that occurred. Everything unrelated to the birth was cut out, but Lionel was able to capture everything about the birth itself. He saw the happiness of the king and queen. He saw the difficulty of the birth. He saw how Queen Guinevere almost lost her life giving birth to this child. And he finally saw the child being born, a beautiful little baby with large black eyes. Unfortunately, this baby was sickly. She had overly pale skin and a feeble breath. She would often nap for long portions of the day, only letting the world see her large blinking eyes for a few minutes a day. Arthur and Guinevere were devastated. As the most powerful pair of mother and father in the land, how could they not pour their everything into the health of their baby girl? At that time, after exhausting all their options, they turned their attention to the budding religion of the land, led by a pope who was rumored to be even more talented than King Arthur himself in the light element. Pope Margrave, please do your best. Queen Guinevere held the little baby girl in her arms. By now, the little girl was already 2 years old, yet her development was severely stunted. Despite already having grown to the age of a toddler, she had yet to be capable of walking on her own, and her size alone made it seem as though she was still a newborn. This left the two new parents completely heartbroken. They didn't understand what they had done wrong. Even when their little girl had been in the womb, they had traveled far and wide to find treatments to take care of her. Guinevere had been fed the best tonics and given the best medicines for all 9 months. They hadn't missed a day of nurturing their child. Yet their little girl had come out like this. How could they not be heartbroken? Pope Margrave looked just as handsome as he always did, but a hint of immaturity marred the momentum of his dignity. He smiled lightly toward the two parents and spoke. I am of course willing to do my best. I only hope that the royal family will protect the church. We only hope to spread our beliefs to the people. King Arthur's expression slightly hardened. His kingdom was just budding. Though religion could help to stabilize the people, it could also serve as an adverse variable. The faith of the common people was a hard thing to overcome. If it was weaponized, the consequences could be imagined. However, when Arthur looked toward the tear-stricken face of his wife and his frail child, his heart wavered. You have this king's word. Arthur spoke resolutely. Pope Margrave smiled and nodded, taking the little girl into his arm. Lionel watched the next sequence of events with shock. Arthur and Guinevere believed that their little girl was being treated with light elemental magic, but this wasn't the case at all. When he had left the eye of the family, Pope Margrave brought the little baby girl to a quiet room. Twisted world. Lionel watched as a surge of darkness shot up around Margrave. The room that had once been bathed in light became surrounded by darkness. Lionel panicked slightly, thinking that the Pope was going to harm the little baby girl. He had unknowingly become attached. He even wanted to see the little baby girl become better. However, deep inside he knew that it was impossible. He had already been to the future. It was either this little girl died or she became. Lionel sighed. The latter was confirmed by what happened next. Rather than being harmed, the little girl which had been napping suddenly became lively. Her sickly little body gained some strength and even let out an adorable little giggle. It was the kind of childish laughter that could warm the heart of even the most cold individual. She raised up her little hands, grasping at Pope Margrave's face. Pope Margrave smiled and let the child play with his finger. He seemed to get a slight happiness from the little girl's eagerness. Lionel finally understood. He had watched it all from start to finish. It was true that King Arthur and Queen Guinevere had done everything they could to nurture their little baby girl. But all this time they had always used the light element. Whether it was the tonics Guinevere drank or the medicines she ate, all of them were of this element. It wasn't really their fault. From their understanding, the light element was the best at healing. In their narrow worldview, it was likely that if they hadn't done all of this, their little girl would have died even sooner or been even worse off. But the truth was that their little girl was healthy. In fact, it was their fault that she was sickly at all. Had they not been feeding her medicines from her opposing element for so long, this little girl would have been just fine. In fact, quite ironically, had they been neglectful parents, the little girl would have been in an even better position than she was now. When the Pope came out with their little girl and the mother-father pair saw how much more lively their little girl was, they couldn't help but shed tears. Even King Arthur, who hadn't cried even when Lamorak died, felt his eyes water. They profusely thanked Pope Margrave and put their all into helping the church grow. All of the worries Arthur had were thrown out of the window. Who cared if he was raising a wolf in his own den? As long as his baby girl was healthy, he didn't care about anything else. Camelot celebrated as their little princess grew. The worries they had about the little one not making any appearances vanished with the wind. Everything was perfect, until the little princess came of age and had her affinity tested. Chapter 3:12. The idea of someone standing against the world seemed like something great and valiant to do. Just thinking about it made one's blood boil. There were maybe few other things that could elicit a person's pride than this. However, what if the person tasked with such a thing was just a little girl of barely 10 years old? What if she was subject to the silence of all the most powerful men and women of a kingdom, all of whom were staring down toward her with varying expressions: shock, apprehension, disgust? The little princess stood in a flowing white dress, her innocent face still smiling as she placed her little hands on a crystal 3 times the size of her body. Her large black eyes sparkled as she watched the flowing black lights. It all looked particularly beautiful to her. She didn't seem to notice the reaction of those around her. She was simply ignorant to them. Her mind was still a blank slate. How could she ever think that she would be shunned by something completely out of her control? "Wow, pretty." The little princess giggled. It was the same giggle that caused the hearts of those around her to flutter. It even cracked the expressions of those that were looking toward her little body with disgust. King Arthur and Queen Guinevere looked toward their daughter with shock, not able to understand what they were seeing. King Arthur was a light magus, a talent rarely seen across several centuries. Queen Guinevere was a water magus. She too was a rare talent and even awakened a variant affinity that tended toward ice. How the daughter that was the product of their union could possibly be a dark magus was completely unknown to them. Was this what they called fate? Tears fell down Guinevere's delicate features as she kneeled down and hugged her daughter, who was still ignorant to how her life had just changed. As for King Arthur, he didn't know how to react. His first instinct was guilt. It was he who insisted on making their daughter's affinity ceremony a public event. He thought that this would be a great opportunity to affirm the standing of their royal family. Though he hadn't known his daughter's affinity, he was certain that she was very talented. Ever since Pope Margrave began to heal her, she displayed an intelligence and wit far beyond her age. There had never been a doubt in Arthur's mind. Maybe somewhat ironically, he had been correct. Those halos of light and those cracks spreading across the crystal's face made it all very obvious. Not only was his daughter a child, she was a monster even amongst childs. But the reality of it was cruel. "Mommy? Why are you crying?" The little princess blinked, unable to understand what was happening. It was only then that she took her eyes off the pretty lights and saw the eyes everyone used to look at her. Seeing the array of emotions, her little heart trembled. Even if she was mostly ignorant of the ways of the world, she was still an intelligent little girl. "Mommy? Did I do something wrong?" Hearing these words, Queen Guinevere felt her heart breaking. "You're all dismissed." King Arthur finally spoke, his expression not giving way for anyone to respond. Those of the court left one after another. Lionel shook his head, watching all of this from start to finish. Was this how superstition worked? Even to the point of forsaking one's own daughter? If it wasn't for the fact the little princess was in fact a princess, maybe she would have been killed on the spot. Unfortunately for the little girl, things weren't ending here, they were only beginning. "What did you just say to me? You want my daughter to do what?" Queen Guinevere's words came out in a hoarse screech. She couldn't believe the words she was hearing. No, it wasn't that she couldn't believe them, but rather that she didn't believe who they were coming from. How could the man she loved say such words? Was this really the same man who she shared a child with? King Arthur was taken aback by his wife's reaction. Had what he said really been so bad? He couldn't help but take offense. "Guinevere, why are you acting like this? I only want to protect our daughter." "By keeping her out of the public eye?" Guinevere's lips curled into a sneer. "All you want to do is protect your precious kingdom. If you have to sacrifice your daughter's freedom and happiness, you wouldn't mind, right? Guinevere, you're living in a fantasy land. Do you really think it's possible for her to live a normal life right now? What kind of freedom could there possibly be in her situation? You can't even say your own daughter's name anymore? Does she disgust you now too?" King Arthur's eyes reddened with rage. Why wouldn't this woman listen to what he was saying? "This decision is final," he roared. Guinevere's sneer only deepened. A deep divide seemed to split the two despite the fact they still stood within the same room. "Please do put your foot down, O esteemed majesty. This is what you always wanted, right? The power to stand over and rule the world? But don't you find it a little sad that you spent all this time fighting for this power, and now you're so scared to lose it that you don't even dare to stand beside your own daughter? What a great king you are. Guinevere's words held a biting cold to it. Her irises involuntarily shone a bright blue as she momentarily lost control of her own magic. King Arthur seemed stunned by what he had just heard. His chest heaved, but he didn't have the words to reply. He stormed out of the room, the boom of the closing door resonating throughout the castle. Ultimately, King Arthur's words were final. Lionel watched as the little princess grew up. He watched her optimism wither and her liveliness dim. The palace maid seemed to keep a wide berth. Her own father was too ashamed to see her. Her mother was the only light in her life, but the pain of the splintering relationship with her husband left even her as a mere shell of her former self. It could only be said that the little girl was alone. Chapter 313. Lionel watched the life of this little princess until the day she chose to leave the kingdom. With her father estranged and her mother unable to provide the same warmth she once had, the one to ultimately suffer the most was a young girl who knew nothing of the world but the same coldness. At that moment, Lionel felt his world swim once again. When his gaze cleared, he found himself floating within a cocoon, facing a young woman that was in the same position. However, while he was awake, she seemed to still be in a deep sleep. The cocoon around Lionel popped. First his clothing came back, then all of his equipment. Even the bow weighed heavily in Lionel's hand. By now, Lionel had gained a faint understanding of the trial. He was meant to understand and empathize with his opponent. The faster he did so, the faster he would awaken and the greater advantage he would gain. If he wanted to win, all he had to do was put an arrow through Modred's head. She couldn't resist him even if she wanted to. She was clearly still immersed in what he assumed were memories of his life. Lionel sighed. What a cruel trial. Lionel didn't particularly understand what the point of this trial was. Did Merlin want to show him that the people he killed to gain the rewards he had were people too? Did Merlin want him to understand his enemy before he killed him? Was there another purpose Lionel had yet to think of? Lionel knew that killing Modred now would be too beneficial to him. If he killed Modred and killed Monet before he left this place, that would allow him exactly the 5 rewards he needed to exchange for a tier 9 reward. Lionel sighed again, closing his eyes. He didn't even need to think about it, he knew that he couldn't do it. He wasn't naive enough to believe that Modred was a good person just because she had a tragic backstory. No matter how understanding he was, it was still clear and obvious to him that her actions in the past several decades had definitely caused a lot of pain to a lot of people. Though Modred looked like a young woman, she was definitely over 40 years old. Even if he saw the reflection of that little girl within her, Lionel knew that she was no longer than innocent little girl and shouldn't be treated as such. Still, Lionel had his own bottom line. So he waited. Seconds turned to minutes, then hours and even days. Lionel knew that Modred's challenge was comparatively more difficult than his own. Lionel's childhood was on Earth, which had a population of billions. Just finding his storyline would be difficult, let alone coming to understand his world. Merlin had definitely not accounted for this possibility in his trials. Lionel wasn't from their world, so how could it not be far more difficult? Plus, Lionel's ability was especially suited to taking in and organizing information. This sort of trial where he was required to filter out the unnecessary and focus in on the important was practically created for him. It wasn't until an entire week later that Modred's lashes finally fluttered. She slowly opened her eyes, the cocoon she was in breaking to reveal her defined body, which was quickly wrapped up in a long flowing black dress. Her gaze flashed with a hint of surprise when she saw Lionel calmly meditating before her. He hadn't opened his eyes even after she awoke, but Modred could tell that he was already on high alert. After a moment, she came to understand what must have happened. After all, she could draw the same conclusions Lionel could. You know, boy, having sympathy for an enemy is as good as asking for death. Modred spoke lightly. Her tone didn't carry any gratefulness, nor was it laced with any of the relief one should have upon escaping death by the hair of their teeth. It was obvious to any semi-intelligent individual that Lionel had shown mercy. But Modred's disregard for her own life was even more surprising. Lionel slowly opened his eyes when he heard Modred speak. Some people would call me quite foolish, yes. Some? Modred asked with an enchanting smile. I think even the few that would do as you did would still call it foolish. Lionel looked toward Modred for a long while, seemingly trying to see through her. Finally he stood, brandishing his bow. Shall we fight? Why so soon? Modred asked lightly. I'm very curious about the world you are from. Just what sort of place is it? Lionel didn't know how to respond to this. Was he supposed to tell Madrid that the pain she suffered as a child was just a fanciful story woven by writers? Would anyone be able to accept that about their lives? If things go well, then you'll get to experience it for yourself, Lionel finally said. Lionel had deliberated over this answer for a long while. He didn't think that there was anything particularly important about his choice of words, he just didn't know how to explain himself, so this was all he could say. However, what he could have never expected was for the whole of the trial grounds to suddenly tremble fiercely the moment he spoke the last of his sentence. Lionel's expression changed. He shot a glance over to Madrid, but he found that she was just as confused as he was. It was clear that she also had no idea what was going on. Without a choice, Lionel pulled out the dictionary. He had to know if the situation had changed. What's happening? Ping. Replying to Seed, hidden quest has been completed. The world of Camelot is integrating with Earth's fold of reality. Lionel stood frozen. What? How could something like this happen? Out of all the possibilities, out of all the thoughts he had, out of all the ways he thought things could go, this was the absolute very last thing he had even considered. The world continued to rumble as Lionel clutched his bow. He really had no idea what would happen next. Chapter 314. Lionel wasn't sure if this was a good thing or a bad thing. What did it mean for Camelot to integrate with Earth's fold of reality? Did that mean that its history was becoming Earth's history? In that case, would there be changes to the current normal zones of Earth? Did it mean that Camelot was descending onto Earth? In that case, did that mean that Earth was gaining new citizens? Or potentially enemies in the demons? Lionel couldn't make heads or tails of what was happening. He couldn't wrap his mind around just how a fairy tale could become a part of real life. But, now that he thought about it, hadn't he been interacting with them all this time? How were the people of Camelot any different from real people? If Lionel had to differentiate them between the people of Earth, he really had no ability to do so. As though this wasn't already confusing enough, Lionel had no idea how he had passed the hidden quest requirements. He had done nothing to this point to work toward that goal. In fact, if he thought about it, he was really stupid for having not at least questioned the dictionary about it first. It was just that he was distracted by learning this new magic system and all the drama that had come with it. Lionel shook his head, completely ignoring Madrid for the time being. What requirements did I meet to cause this? More than anything else, he was the most curious about this. Actually, it might have very well been possible that he wasn't the one who met the requirements at all. After all, there was still Monet, Violet Rain and Little Nana here. Even though Little Nana had been booted from the trial, she was still one of the zone participants and Lionel had left her alone for a long while already. Ping. Replying to Seed, there are two requirements that need to be met, awareness and acceptance. Lionel felt as though he had been struck by a bolt of lightning. These two requirements seemed simple enough, but the longer he thought about it, the more impossible they seemed to be to fulfill. Awareness alone seemed easy enough. Just telling Madrid that a world like his existed might be enough to fulfill the requirements of this first prerequisite. But, what about acceptance? How could you possibly get someone who was born and raised in Camelot to both be aware that there were other worlds and accept their existence? In truth, even if someone wanted to accept this, it might not necessarily be possible. The only person in this world one couldn't fool was oneself. It was not possible to make oneself think something one didn't want to think or feel a way one didn't want to feel. Let's say, for instance, that Lionel was told that a metamorphosis was coming before it descended. Let's say he was also told that he and everyone else who managed to survive would gain amazing powers beyond imagination. And, let's say that it was his father who told him all of these things and warned him to prepare or else it might cost him his life. Lionel might want to believe these words. After all, they came from his father. If he couldn't trust the man he trusted the most in this whole world, then who the hell would he trust? But even if he wanted to believe, could he? At that time, Lionel would have known nothing of the world but what was right in front of him. On top of that, he would have been raised in an environment where science and research was above all else. How could he so easily throw all of these things to the back of his mind to accept what sounded like a nutcase's rantings? This was what it meant to gain acceptance. Madrid not only needed to be aware another world might exist, but she also needed to accept to her very soul that it did. After coming to this understanding, Lionel couldn't help but chuckle. This fourth trial might have been exceptionally cruel, but it actually did him a massive favor. If it wasn't for living Lionel's life from start to finish, how could Madrid so easily accept the truth? Lionel took a deep breath and calmed himself, looking up to see Madrid's playful gaze. The trial's rumbling continued and seemed to only intensify with each passing moment. It left Lionel feeling disoriented and a bit dizzy. This seemed to remind him that there was much more he had no idea about. How is the integration happening? Ping asterisk. Camelot will form its own satellite and orbit around the core of Earth's fold of reality. Lionel raised his brow. He knew that satellite was a technical term astronomers used. It described both artificial and celestial bodies that orbited a planet. Did that mean that Earth was getting another moon? What did this mean for Earth? What would it do to the already volatile political climate? How would the Empire react? What about those hidden families? The Slayer Legion? Lionel felt a massive headache coming on. But something felt off about this continuous rumbling. Lionel subconsciously felt as though something was hindering Camelot's progression. How long will this take? And does this mean the zone trial is over? Lionel asked. Madrid blinked her pretty eyes. Zone trial? She seemed to be very curious about this. What did it mean exactly? This little toy also seemed to be quite interesting. Ping asterisk. Lionel was stunned. The dictionary wasn't answering? This was the first time this had happened. What did this mean? Just when Lionel wanted to ask again, the rumbling reached a peak. Lionel's vision blurred and swam. He felt his entire body being forcefully ejected. It felt as though his body had been sucked into a black hole, stretching into a thin line that was pulled out of his current reality. Bang! Lionel crashed onto something hard, but his vision was still too black to see anything. However, what he did see when his vision cleared left him stunned. Chapter 3:15. Lionel had crashed into a ground of gray, cracked land. There seemed to be no vegetation anywhere around except for some sporadic weeds that seemed painted with an ink black. This place was actually the no man's land between Camelot and the Demon Empire. Lionel's first reaction was as expected. How could he not be infuriated? He had been that close to being able to afford to comprehend the complete Four Seasons realm. Even if it was someone else's comprehension, the benefit to his strength would have by no means been small. Yet, now that he had been ejected from the trial, it was all over. However, Lionel didn't have the luxury to dwell on this because what he saw next took up all the headspace he had. He felt like his breath had been completely sucked away. Was this what the apocalypse looked like? Right where the entrance to the trials had been there was a massive sinkhole. It seemed to extend to infinity, having unfathomable depths. If this was all there was, it would be enough to panic. Yet, the sinkhole seemed to be connected to the skies by an invisible pillar of energy. The rumbling, black clouds above formed a large eye of the storm above, swirling and forming a massive cyclone. The sight of large masses of cumulonimbus clouds moving along with flickering lightning and heavily falling rain made it feel as though each clap of thunder was crashing against one's heart. This alone would have been enough of a shocking scene to put anyone in awe. However, when Lionel activated his internal sight to its fullest degree, he realized that this place that looked as though a mighty god had struck down with his spear from above wasn't so simple at all. He could sense endless fragments of countless laws. Each of them formed whole or partial force arts representing a different strength. It was so faint that most of it was invisible even to those who had already awakened their internal strength. Lionel took a deep breath and closed his eyes. When they snapped open once again, the faint image of a majestic bird loomed over his shoulder. No, it was less accurate to say that it was a bird, but rather a bird's gaze. Two pairs of wisdom-filled eyes hung above Lionel while the faint outline of its avian body was hardly detectable. The instant Lionel activated his wisdom branch lineage factor in full force, the world before him seemed to explode into one filled with stars and flashing lights. Those vague outline of force arts were all reflected in his mind, flickering with a beautiful mystery. Lionel had never used the wisdom branch of his snowy star owl lineage factor like this. There was never a need to, using it passively was enough. But he had never expected that there would actually come a day that he would need it. Or rather, he hadn't expected that day to come so soon. There's a chance. Lionel was certain that these laws were the ones that represented the Merlin trial grounds. Together, they were what formed the domain that had kept them trapped for so long. If he found the arts he needed, it might be possible to reverse engineer the legendary skills. Just when Lionel was feeling excited, an overwhelming danger suddenly prickled at his nape. In his current state, his senses were impossibly high. He could tell in an instant that he was being targeted even before the strike was in range to be fatal. Lionel sprang upward and rolled to the side, making sure to extend the distance between himself and the sinkhole. A violent crack of light landed where he had sat, tearing into the ground for several meters before coming to a stop. Lionel rolled to his feet, facing the direction he felt the fluctuation of magic coming from. As he did, He allowed the pair of eyes floating to his back to slowly fade away. He had already made the mistake of letting his stamina run out before. Now it was at the forefront of his mind. Though activating his wisdom branch wasn't nearly as taxing, he still chose to be careful. In the distance, King Arthur held onto his sword, his aura blazing. However, he could only hide how shaken he felt. In the instant before those eyes faded, he felt as though he had been pierced through. It felt no different from a blade running through his chest. Just what kind of ability was that? When Lionel came out of his own world, he realized that he wasn't the only one that had been forcefully ejected from the trial. He immediately noticed that the numbers had dwindled by half. It was clear that not all the trials ended the same way his and Modred's had. The heavily falling rain rebounded off the bodies of the warriors. After King Arthur's move, no one else did anything. It was as though they were all aware that this was the calm before the storm. Lionel wasn't the only one who noticed the oddly floating force arts, though he was the one who could definitely see them the most clearly. Everyone here were the elite of the elites. How could their internal sight be normal? They all realized that this was an opportunity. My luck is so bad. Lionel couldn't help but want to shed tears. He had the inside track to completing the Four Seasons realm thanks to his ridiculous number of slaughter and star points, but now he actually had to fight again for what he had already earned. As though that wasn't enough, he seemed to still be public enemy number one. As though that wasn't bad enough, the segmented cube had also fallen a distance away and it was still in its large form. Lionel definitely couldn't leave without it. Not only was that a treasure his father had entrusted to him, but little Nana was still within. It was then that the situation changed once more. Through the rumbling thunder and heavily falling rain, the sound of cracking glass and falling beads entered the ears of all present. Though it was odd to describe it in this way, this was the image that Lionel immediately formed in his mind. When he looked up, he found numerous cracks in space. Within these spaces, flickering gems began to make themselves known. Very soon, it became obvious that these weren't flickering gems at all. They were treasures. These were the very treasures that had been part of the special ticket store. Lionel's expression changed. If Camelot is becoming a part of true history, doesn't that mean I can take these treasures out? Lionel swept his gaze over the 36 or so remaining elites, his heart tightening. It seemed the situation had become more complicated again. Chapter 316. Lionel took a deep breath. This was no longer the trial grounds. While this meant that he was no longer restricted by cooldowns and limited by skills, it also meant that this was the same for everyone else. This made this situation several times more difficult than it had been in the past. Lionel believed that if he tried to use his Dreamscape battle sense now, the drain on his mind would be even greater without the limitation on the actions his opponent could take. But for the time being, Lionel couldn't worry about this any longer. Lionel's senses reached out once more. Though it seemed like he was paying attention to the opponents before him through the heavy rain, he was actually looking for legend skills. Lionel realized something very important. Though it was negative that he could no longer guarantee himself the Four Seasons realm with his bow, that didn't mean it was a net negative. While he couldn't guarantee anything anymore, his paths had suddenly broadened. With all of these force arts floating around, did that mean that he could find the legend skills for his spear as well? Just as Lionel was about to act, someone else couldn't hold back any longer. Lionel locked onto a demon lord. Surprisingly, it was the very same zombie demon lord he had met during his first battle in this no man's land, Coyote. Lionel remembered what Lancelot had said about this demon lord. Back then he had been with the demon lord Dagon, a skeleton demon with heavy balls chained to his wrists and ankles. According to Lancelot, Dagon was ranked in the high 20s amongst demon lords and was even comparable to those in the top 20. Yet, compared to him, Coyote was much more dangerous. The reason was simple. There was simply too little information about him. No one knew his likes, his dislikes, his tendencies, nothing. Maybe even Mordred was in the dark about this. Coyote shot forward, his rotting eyes completely placid as though he didn't notice the tense situation they were all in. A foul stench wafted from his body as heavy droplets of acidic rain rebounded off his dead skin. A spear? Lionel took notice of Coyote's weapon immediately. This was most definitely not the weapon Coyote had used during that battle. It seemed that he had been hiding even his main choice of weapon from others. In fact, as far as Lionel remembered, he barely had any impression of Coyote during the trials. However, now that Lionel thought about it, he remembered that the only time he ever saw Coyote display any types of emotions was when the latter felt greed after Lionel took out his black chain spear. Back then, Lionel had been paying particular attention to the two demon lords in case they interfered in his battle with the Minotaur. With his ability to read people, he would never mistake such an emotion. Wait, Lionel's frown deepened. For someone like as cautious and low-key as Coyote to be making a move now? Lionel's gaze flashed, locking onto a certain direction. When he realized what was happening, his frown couldn't help but deepen. Coyote wasn't running in the direction of a legendary skill. But Lionel knew it was impossible for such a man to take such a risk for nothing. So that's how it is. Lionel finally understood, but he hesitated. He already had so many enemies. If he made one of Coyote too, while no one had moved after Coyote did, Lionel could guarantee that if he did, several wouldn't stay idle any longer. Lionel shook his head, steeling his heart. This hesitation, it wasn't like him. Lionel shot forward, his sudden movement catching the attention of all those who had been paying particular attention to him. Still, of those paying attention, Coyote was the most shocked. He had been very cautious since the beginning. Before he made this move, he had deduced that there was a better than 50% likelihood that no one would bother with him and would choose to instead observe from afar. After all, the situation was still tense. Humans and demons alike had a tendency of letting others test the waters for them. Like this, it would be possible to test for any dangers ahead of time. However, he could have never expected that Lionel would actually throw all of this to the back of his mind. In fact, not only had Lionel done so, but it seemed as though his target was completely different from Coyote's. Yet, judging by the fact Lionel's gaze hadn't left the zombie demon lord from start to finish, Coyote knew that he had been seen through. A smirk curled Coyote's lip. It seems that I've been seen through. But so what? They must think I'm weak just because I choose to keep a low profile. Who do you think you are to challenge my will? Your spear is mine. Coyote didn't bother hiding his intentions any longer. With a hard plant of his foot, he deviated his intention direction slightly, shooting toward the empty space between himself and Lionel. Those with weak internal sight wouldn't be able to see anything but a foggy space. However, it was clear that both Lionel and the zombie demon lord had seen something others hadn't. Lionel was just 50 meters from his location. The sloshing of the growing mud beneath his feet didn't seem to impact his speed in the slightest. But it seemed that he had underestimated just how much King Arthur wanted him dead. Minor teleportation. Lionel knew the spell well. Not only did it take up a large amount of stamina for a usual magus, but it took half a minute and sometimes even more to cast. It was simply impractical to use during battle unless one was at the level where casting multiple spells in conjunction was possible. For King Arthur to use this spell now only meant one thing. He had begun preparing it long ago and saved it for the express purpose of obstructing Lionel. No matter how kind-hearted and understanding Lionel was, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of rage from the depths of his heart. From start to end, it was always this so-called King Arthur obstructing him in every way and fashion. Did this king really think that he was a pushover? Did he look like a man that could be targeted for death time and time again without consequences? Lionel's aura billowed, his bow disappearing in favor of a heavy spear. Clang, clang, clang. The sound of the black spear's chains drowned out even the thunder in the sky above. Lionel could feel that his spear had been waiting to be released for a long time. He had repressed it for a long time already, it was finally time to unleash it. Lionel's gaze seemed to pierce through the space separating himself and the king. Even if he couldn't kill this bastard, Lionel didn't mind teaching him a harsh lesson he would never forget. How could he wield that sword so arrogantly without an arm? Chapter 317. King Arthur widened his stance, grasping his sword with both hands. His blonde hair billowed beneath the falling rain. Even in this environment he seemed completely untouched, a holy golden aura keeping him completely dry. Lionel charged forward, his black spear resonating with the clapping thunder. His every step was entirely enveloped by a golden light, accelerating his speed several times over. At the same time, bronze runes etched themselves across his body, drawing a crown on his forehead and hovering a halo above his head. Raging violet lights emitted from his body, directly suppressing Arthur's kingly might. It felt as though this was the true arrival of a king. A man who could hold his head even higher than the legendary King Arthur. Such a feeling made the rage in Arthur's heart deepen. This brat? Above him? It seemed that since his sword hadn't tasted blood in so long, his legend had been forgotten. At that moment, spear and sword met. The clash caused a violent wind to spread out with them as the center. Sword force sliced the wind apart to one side and spear force billowed into the sky from the other. The land around Lionel and Arthur shook and quaked, their gazes meeting across their weapons. Lionel could see the unconcealed rage within Arthur's eyes. Arthur could see the cold indifference in Lionel's. At that moment, they completely forgot and were uncaring about Coyote. It seemed that the actions of the zombie demon lord was meaningless. The 5 remaining knights of the Round Table, including Gawain, watched on, hands on their weapons. There were certain battles they knew they shouldn't interfere in. In the past, these battles were the ones Arthur fought to build his legend. And now they felt that this battle was no less important. Somewhere a long distance away, Queen Guinevere stepped out onto a terrace, looking up toward the rumbling skies. A deep sadness and complexity reflected within her eyes. Somehow, she felt that this battle would be important as well even without being present. It wasn't a matter of winning or losing. It was deeper than that. Lionel and Arthur separated, their weapons vibrating wildly. Arthur's aura surged, force climbing around his body to impossible heights. It had been too long since the King of Camelot had gone all out. Many had forgotten just how powerful he had once been. It seemed impossible that a child of not even 20 years old could face him. But the Lionel of now wasn't the Lionel of the past. After receiving so many rewards, his force had been crystallized to an elite degree. Even the Lamorak of the past couldn't match him, and he was even faintly approaching Arthur's level. If he could already hold his own to a certain extent before, what about now? Holy judgment. Holy judgment. Not caring for the thoughts of others, Lionel immediately cast the very same spell Arthur had. Today he would prove a point. This arrogant king. He needed to learn that he couldn't be arrogant just before anyone. Brilliant swords formed in the skies, however Lionel's formed several times faster. Before Arthur's spell was even complete, Lionel's golden swords had descended, shattering their arts to nothing. Saintly light. Saintly light. Lionel responded coldly. A pillar of light descended toward Arthur before his spell completed, forcing him to dodge out of the way and cancel his own cast. The ground shook and groaned, leaving a pit in the spot he had just once been. Sacrificial cross. Arthur raised his sword, a blinding light forming at its tip. However, just when he was about to slash downward, a cold voice floated to his ears, tearing at his eardrums. Sacrificial cross. Lionel's spear slashed downward with a powerful momentum, then across with an arrogant burst. A cross of blinding golden light shot forward, tearing toward King Arthur. The king brandished his sword, hurriedly blocking, but he couldn't stop himself from sliding backward tens of meters, the web of his fingers tearing apart. Lionel brandished his spear, taking a step forward. His hair billowed, seemingly untouched by the heavy rain. His halo hung above his head and his piercing violet eyes peered toward Arthur as though to question him. Is this the product of your arrogance? Is this what you were so proud of? Light domain. Light domain. A sphere of light appeared before Lionel, quickly expanding until it became a dome that shrouded over 20 meters. It completely crushed Arthur's own spell, shattering his sphere before it even expanded outside of his body. Lionel held his spear in his right, raising his left. He pointed a finger forward, causing beams of light to form all around him under the influence of light domain. In this world of darkness, he seemed like the only source of light, willing the light element to manifest itself to his beck and call. Arthur's gaze had turned a furious shade of red. It seemed as though his pupils might drip with blood at any moment. As he brandished his sword, blocking Lionel's furious assault of light, he felt as though something deep within his chest was being chipped away at. He knew he wasn't this weak. Lionel knew he wasn't this weak either. But his pride wouldn't let him stop casting spells. His pride wouldn't allow him to accept that Lionel was his better in this aspect. No matter what spell he cast, Lionel could do it faster and form it with greater strength. Lionel's barrage became faster and faster. Beneath the effect of light domain, it was as though a tiger had grown wings. His light elemental arts formed even faster than they had before. He felt as though he could take control of the whole world. Domain, this was the feeling of a domain. An absolute control. An undeniable sovereignty. The spear within Lionel's hand began to shake and rattle wildly. It felt as though it wanted to break free and soar into the skies, looking over all from above. A certain enlightenment shook Lionel's heart. For the first time he felt the call of the spear in his hands. At that very moment, Coyote had appeared before the legendary skill art, his rotting lips curled into a smirk. What no one expected was for the situation to change once again the instant Coyote grasped the legendary skill in his hands. The sound of shattering glass resounded once more, but this was several times louder than when the treasures appeared. It was as though a massive glass statue had fallen from the skies and crashed onto the ground below. Within any explanation, Lionel felt a surging sense of crisis. The primitive man's instincts had already sunk deep into his bones. After being stacked with several other primitive consciousnesses, his instincts had already reached another level, helping his battle sense greatly. In fact, if it wasn't for this, maybe his dreamscape battle sense wouldn't have manifested so easily or so quickly. Without hesitation he ducked down. As though sensing the same thing, Arthur did the same. Those who were lucky followed the crowd even if they didn't sense it themselves. However, those who were unlucky found themselves riddled with holes from an attack they couldn't even see with their own two eyes. Lionel watched as several elites fell dead, not daring to get up on his own just yet. Even 3 of the Knights of the Round Table fell beneath this inexplicable barrage. At that moment, Lionel's dreamscape flashed with a violent arc of lightning centering around a particular book. The Legend of Affinities, the Epic of Magi. According to the book, there were 2 affinities that were rarer than the light element, 2 affinities that had only appeared within the legendary magus of an era. Merlin. The time and space affinity. That attack, that was most definitely a spatial ripple. However, it wasn't caused by a person. It was caused by the appearance of something. Lionel craned his neck from the ground, looking back toward the massive sinkhole he had distanced himself from originally. When he set his senses forward, a massive force arc reflected in his mind. It was so large and unfathomable that he felt his mind swim just after glancing at it for but a moment. However, what was more surprising was that it reminded him of something he had forgotten about. Memories flashed within Lionel's mind. He finally remembered his healing branch. He had already awakened it. And the 4th-dimensional art hanging within his dream world. It was the reason he had been able to. Not only was it the reason, but it was eerily similar to the force art before him now. Lionel's heart palpitated. He knew for a fact that this force art was the core that made up Merlin's trial grounds. All this time, the 4th-dimensional art within Lionel's world was at 99% complete, but no matter what he did, he couldn't seem to get over the edge and reach 100%. Yet, simply glimpsing at that 99% complete art in a dazed state was enough for him to instantly comprehend his healing branch. Just what kind of effect would it have on other things? Just what kind of effect would it have at 100%? 1% might sound like a small distance away, but Lionel knew that this final percent was more difficult to complete than even the first 99% as a whole. If he managed to finish it, the effect wouldn't be as small as double or even triple, it might even be tens of folds. Lionel realized in that instant that the most valuable thing here wasn't the legendary treasures or even the legendary skills. It was the force art right before him. However, Lionel didn't seem to be the only one who realized this. The moment this art appeared, the eyes of Pope Margrave and the dual sword-wielding Pierce, who had both maintained a low profile to this point, lit up. Chapter 318. Pierce stood from the mud-soaked grounds and took a step forward, brandishing his 2 long swords. Stand down. Gawain looked toward Pierce with reddened eyes. They had just lost 3 Knights of the Round Table. As things stood now, there was only Gawain and Ector remaining. It could be said that this was the greatest blow Camelot had taken since its establishment. Gawain's #1 priority was protecting the lives of those that remained. He couldn't allow a moment of hot-headedness or greed to ruin the foundation of Camelot. The gaze he looked toward Pierce seemed only a step away from madness. He had too many clashing emotions in his mind. On the one hand, he didn't agree with the way Arthur was doing things. But, on the other, he didn't want to see his king lose like this, nor did he want his fellow brothers to sacrifice themselves one after another. In the height of his emotions, Gawain believed that Pierce was trying to step in to defend Arthur's honor. Everything he knew about Pierce to this point defined him as a man of honor and nobility. Acting to defend Arthur at this point was exactly what the persona of the past would have done. However, Gawain would have never expected for a simple command of his to cause Pierce's sword to find its way to his neck. Gawain might have been in an emotional state, but he was still one of the 12 strongest knights beneath King Arthur. He reacted with an inhuman quickness, arching his back toward the ground and barely dodging the long, slightly curved sword. Still, he felt a cold wind across his throat. When he brought his fingers up, he found that a thin line of blood had already been drawn across his Adam's apple. Death had been just that close. When Gawain got over his shock, he immediately felt a surging anger. Pierce, what do you mean by this? Gawain's roar seemed to be trying to rival the rumbling clouds above, but it was, maybe fittingly, completely drowned out. Before Pierce even got a chance to respond, Gawain suddenly felt a sharp pain to his back. He looked down shaken. His body trembled, blood leaking from his lips as he tried to speak. But the spear that had gone through his chest didn't seem apt to allow him to do so. Gawain struggled to turn his head back, only to be shocked to find his brother-in-arms, Sir Ector. Shock, unwillingness, resentment. It all flashed through Gawain's eyes in those last moments. But all he saw in Ector's eyes was a dullness, as though he didn't care about taking the life of his friend of so many years. Gawain's body fell limp and lifeless, the plop of his figure onto the wet ground somehow resounding more than his final roar. The eerie sound seemed to wake Ector from his daze. He blinked, his eyes squinting in confusion. He looked from his bloodied spear to the body on the ground. When he thought of a certain possibility, his heart shook. Aelyard! Ector's tragic cry sounded like a wounded beast. He was so furious that the blood vessels of his eyes popped, causing streaking tears of blood to coat his cheeks. However, they were quickly washed away by the heavily falling rain, as though the world itself didn't want him to grieve. Ector turned his gaze toward an unassuming Magus, a seemingly amiable old man Lionel knew well. If it wasn't for Aelyard, Lionel wouldn't have lost control of his emotions during his first meeting with Lamorak, and maybe their relationship wouldn't have turned out as tragically as it did. Beseech you. A spurt of blood flew of Ector's neck, his head snapping backward as small bits of remaining flesh tried to keep it attached to his shoulders. In his death, he didn't get to see who did it. However, there had only been one person in that direction. It could only have been Pierce. Ector could have never believed that he would be betrayed by not one, but two people of Camelot. This entire sequence of events was witnessed by both Lionel and King Arthur. The latter had reached such a state of rage that his visage had returned to an eerie calm. It was a kind of calm that even made Lionel's heart tremble. What kind of feeling was it to watch 6 of your brothers killed one after another? Not only killed, but to even be betrayed by 2 you once thought you could trust with your life? There were many times that Arthur had thought of expanding the Knights of the Round Table to 13 just to add Pierce. Magus Aelyard was a pillar of Camelot, one of the 7 more powerful mages of their kingdom. Yet, both of them had slighted him in this way. At this point, his rage toward the 2 of them was several levels beyond the rage he felt for Lionel. Lionel cautiously rose, his eyes narrowing as he looked toward Aelyard. So that's how things are. Maybe even Lamorak was being unknowingly influenced. There were many people Lionel thought that might be traitorous. He knew there was a high likelihood of a mythological zone becoming a unique zone, so he had always been paying attention. He subconsciously focused on Lamorak because the latter had not only humiliated him, but always seemed to be outrageously antagonistic for little to no reason. Then, after he saw Mordred's backstory, he realized that the Pope might very well be involved as well. But he had forgotten one thing. Aelyard had been there that day too. And he was a mage that specialized in mental attacks. What if from beginning to end, this was all orchestrated by Aelyard? Lionel's eyes fell on the seemingly amiable, scholarly man. His aura wasn't as towering as King Arthur's, yet the wind and rain seemed to bend around him as though not wanting to disturb him. "You're very curious," Aelyard spoke. Despite the billowing winds, heavy rain and rumbling clouds, not to mention the hundreds of meters that separated them, Lionel felt as though he was speaking right into his ear. "You've been branded by the bishop. Why are you not following his orders properly?" Lionel's pupils constricted. Chapter 319. The Bishop. It had been too long since Lionel heard mention of this person. Within the Joan Zone, this entity seemed to rule the lives of Joan and the men around her. At first, Lionel had thought that the bishop was the man in the tunnels, Nicholas. Lionel still remembered the fanaticism in Nicholas' gaze when he asked him if he was well known in the future. Despite the fact the man was his enemy, Lionel couldn't help but feel bad for him at the time. These people were likely promised great things, but how many of them really got to enjoy these rewards? Nicholas thought he had become some famous legend in the future, yet Lionel had never heard of him. Wasn't that too sick of a joke? The moment Lionel heard Aelyard's words, he realized that this really was related to the matters of the Joan Zone. In all likelihood, his previous conjecture that their purpose in the Joan Zone was related to their successful entry into this mythological zone was most likely also correct. But what made Lionel more apprehensive was that Aelyard said he had been branded. Was he talking about the force art he had drawn on the back of his left hand? But hadn't he gotten rid of it? How was it that Aelyard still thought he was branded? The moment Lionel returned to Earth's pseudo-fourth dimension, the art's effects were shattered. Could it be that Aelyard had sensed its previous influence? Lionel looked toward the back of his left hand. He could still see the vague outline of the once prominent scar, but the magic it once held had long since disappeared. Lionel looked back up, facing Aeliard. "So you're the one who made Lamorak target me?" he asked coldly. Aeliard didn't respond. He seemed to feel that this conversation was meaningless. Lionel's gaze narrowed. It seemed that he had been a puppet on a string from the very beginning. Whether it was his battle with Lamorak, his terrible reaction back then, even down to the fact Aeliard's disciple Alice had been the one following him and guiding him all this time, it might even be possible that Aeliard was slowly manipulating things in the background to make more and more people turn their blades toward Lionel within the trial grounds. The more Lionel thought about it, the more he felt his heart chill. He closed his eyes, settling the rolling waves in his chest. When he opened them once again, his calm had returned. "Thanks, you've taught me a lot," Lionel said placidly. Clang, clang, clang. Lionel brandished his spear, the clanging of the spears reaching a feverish pitch. Lionel flipped his palm, causing a horn to appear in his hand. If one looked closely and had been there that day, it would be possible to recognize this horn as having once been the property of the black rhino Lionel had defeated during his trip to this no-man's land. Back then, Lionel had just wanted to complete a few missions so that he could read the rest of what the Mage Academy library had to offer. But now this horn had become his trump card. Since these traitors had revealed themselves so easily, even after seeing the combat prowess of Lionel and Arthur, and even taking into account the existence of Mordred and the others, it meant they were confident in their own strength. Confident to the point of believing they no longer had to hide themselves. However, did he really look like someone who could just be rolled over? Lionel guessed that the goal of these people and the bishop was the fourth-dimensional force art to his back. Maybe in the meantime they wouldn't mind picking up some treasures and comprehending some legendary skills along the way. To them, this was practically an open treasure trove they could take up whenever they wanted. The so-called resistance before them was meaningless. Lionel laughed. But when others heard it, they felt their hearts tremble. They could hear all of his emotions. His bitterness, his rage, his pride. In the past several months he had been toyed with like a puppet on a string. He thought himself to be intelligent, yet he hadn't even realized who his true enemy was until the last moments. Now that he thought about it, Aeliard was probably only dissatisfied with him because he wanted to make use of Lamorak for a bit longer. By Aeliard's estimation, had Lionel not killed Lamorak and gone against the wishes of the bishop, Aeliard would have never been exposed at all. After all, his suggestive magic on Lamorak had been weaved over several months to years. It was much too subtle compared to Hector, who he rashly took control of just for a few moments. Though he didn't mind being exposed now, he felt as though it was unnecessary and he felt forced by the circumstances. He didn't like not having everything in the palm of his hands. To him, Lionel's actions were akin to a jumping monkey stalling the path of a king. However, even Aeliard couldn't help but frown slightly toward Lionel's laughter. He could tell that this laughter wasn't one of hopelessness, nor was it one of madness. It was almost like the kind of laugh you gave a friend when you fell for a prank. It was simply too light. Lionel brought the horn up to his lips and blew. At first, the horn was a deep black luster. It curled up for over a meter and weighed almost 100 pounds. However, after Lionel blew, several gorgeous patterns lit up across its surface, shimmering with a beautiful pale green light. The billowing wind from Lionel's blow tore into the skies, causing the thunderous storm to pause for just a moment. Aeliard's pupils constricted. It wasn't just him, but so did Pope Margraves. As the two most accomplished mages on the battlefield, they realized exactly what just happened. This was definitely beast-taming magic, but they had never seen it used in this way. Lionel calmly put the horn away as though he hadn't done anything special. In its place he pulled out a familiar golden rod. Though it no longer held France's flag on one end of it, Lionel would never forget this pole. It was none other than a replica of Joan's weapon. "I didn't get to use this against the monocle-wearing bastard. But that's just fine. I happen to hate you all almost as much." Did they think that he, Lionel Morales, was someone they could easily deal with whenever they wanted to? He would make Aeliard and the other lackeys of this so-called bishop pay a price for their arrogance. And the cost he was asking for was nothing less than their lives. Chapter 320. The blaring horn seemed capable of separating even the thick clouds above. Those close to it felt as though they had suddenly been thrust into the center of a storm. Even after the sound traveled tens of kilometers, it refused to dissipate, multiplying over itself and projecting outward for longer and longer distances. Lionel stood amidst the rain with an indifferent expression. However, the ground had already begun to rumble. If the world had already felt as though it might end at any time, it was practically on the brink of destruction now. Aelyard's expression had been bordering on smugness just moments ago. But now it felt as though everything within his body had tightened. He stared daggers toward Lionel, but the latter remained unmoved. At that moment, the first roars came from over the horizon. Massive demonic beasts of all shapes and sizes charged forward as though they had lost their minds, savage expressions being projected from their red eyes. It could be said that Lionel was an absolute expert of every path of magic Camelot had to offer. As long as it was within the magic art tower, it was stored within his dream world, never to leave. The only reason he never used elements outside of light and earth was because it simply wasn't worth it. With his affinity, casting light or earth arts took half the stamina, could be completed in half the time and carried twice the strength. Why would he waste his time casting other arts when this was the case? However, there were especially rare instances where the paths of other mages were beneficial to him. Whether it was when he used a teleportation art as a trump card or when he used the sensory blockers of mental mages to form the maze within Camelot's castle, both of these were instances of Lionel taking a step out of his true comfort zone. The use of this horn was yet another instance. Originally, Lionel hadn't had a plan to use Joan's treasure. He originally saved it within his dreamscape only to test his new dream sculpt ability. Back then Joan's treasure had just been a useful outlet. However, after he met Simeon again, he realized that this treasure might become very useful when disrupting Simeon's control over his beasts. Unfortunately, Simeon had smartly retreated long before Lionel got a chance to use this trump card he had kept in reserve. When Lionel came to this SS grade zone, he found himself pushed into a corner again and again. He realized that he needed trump cards or else this really might be the place he died. The problem was that alone. Joan's staff was useless. Lionel didn't dare to use it on humans for fear of the backlash. He affirmed this unwillingness after reaching this world. With the strong mental strength of mages, who would dare casually try to take control of their minds? Even Aelyard had to be especially careful. Due to this realization, Lionel thought that Joan's staff might very well become useless to him until he met Simeon again. But, when he was browsing the mage arts of the magic art tower, he suddenly stumbled into the world of beast mages. Overall, they were a small profession, often overlooked entirely. Many of them were just glorified mailmen, used to take control of messaging birds to communicate between long distances. However, it was in them Lionel saw endless potential and a plan began to form in his mind. The horn just happened to be a useful medium, but the true strength of the horn were the spells Lionel inscribed onto it. These spells were to beasts what mermaids were to sailors. The moment they heard it, they couldn't help but be lured to Lionel uncontrollably. Lionel had been saving this card in his back pocket for a long time, waiting for an opportune moment to use it. In fact, looking toward Lionel now, King Arthur felt an endless bubbling fear within his heart. What if Lionel had blown this horn from within the walls of Camelot? What would the result have been then? This was maybe the first time King Arthur had ever felt such a way. If Lionel had wanted to raze Camelot to the ground, could he really have done it? There was one point that made all of this all the more shocking. In order to stall Camelot and force them to keep some warriors back to defend their lands, Mordred had commanded beast tides to attack human settlements. Of course, she couldn't control these beasts, she could only direct them in particular directions almost like a glorified herder. However, due to Mordred's actions, not only were there higher concentrations of beasts in this region than there was usually, they were also in large groups. Could it be that Lionel had taken this into account as well? Just who was this boy? Lionel raised his golden road. A powerful, surging spirit pressure shot into the skies, separating into dozens of thin lines of energy. Arthur, Mordred, come here. Arthur frowned. His initial instinct was to reject Lionel's words. But what the latter said next made his blood freeze. Come here or the first person I trample will be you. Lionel's voice turned completely icy, carrying an air of majesty that seemed to project directly from the halo above his head. If it wasn't about his own life, he would let Arthur be trampled to death. As for saving Mordred, that was for two reasons. For one, he still felt a hint of sympathy toward this beauty. But, more importantly, she was the key to fixing her father's marriage. Mordred's lashes blinked somewhat flirtatiously. Her tastes were usually quite young to begin with, as she had once told Monet. In fact, she had never even considered being with a man, nor was she attracted to them. But she had quite a good impression of this child. Even within the rain, she glided forward elegantly, completely ignoring Arthur as though he didn't exist. At this point, the battlefield was caught in an odd stalemate. Unfortunately, The first of the beasts had already crossed into their fields of vision. Chapter 321. Aelyard and those with him wanted to charge toward Lionel, but they were hesitant to do so. Though they had previously looked down on Lionel, this didn't mean that they thought they could defeat Lionel in a few exchanges. They knew that they would have to at least put forward a small effort. The root cause of their confidence was their larger number of quality experts. Whether it was Pierce, Margrave or Aelyard, they could all battle King Arthur and had better than 50% odds in defeating him. This was without even counting any other trump cards they may or may not have. However, if they charged for Lionel now, they would become embroiled in battle. By then the beast tide would definitely be upon them. They weren't naive enough to believe that Lionel would summon these beasts without the ability to control them, and they could see that it was most likely related to the golden rod in his hands. At that point they would have to battle not only Lionel but an endless swarm of beasts. Could it be that they would really fall just like this? Aelyard stood opposing the growing group by Lionel's side. Just moments ago one could have never expected to see such a sight. Not only were there humans by Lionel's side, but even the number 1 demon lord, Krakos, and a few others of his side had converged. These demons had fully expected Lionel to reject them, yet he said nothing. When the beast tide reached them, the immediate area around Lionel became a safe haven. As though the land around them was sacred to the point even mindless beasts didn't dare to step on it, the swarm took a curved path around them, charging toward the group of 3 men. Pope Margrave, Pierce and Aelyard stood in an inverted triangle position, protecting Aelyard to their backs. Solemn expressions coated each one of their faces. Individually these beasts were nothing to them. But when they came in swarms like this, just how long would they be able to last? But they had to. Their goal had been planned out for too long. If they failed here, the consequences would be unimaginable. They couldn't afford to bear them. Pierce's twin blades were like twin scythes, leaving blurred images beneath the rain as trails of crimson blood followed their every movement. Pope Margrave held his cross to his chest, chanting solemnly with his eyes fluttering close. A barrier of light enveloped Pierce and Aelyard, replenishing their stamina with each passing moment. Aelyard himself had several veins popping across his forehead. Every time a surge of spirit pressure came from him, another beast seemed to be ripped from Lionel's control, crashing into the others and starting a battle to the death. Lionel watched all of this with a pair of cold eyes. He didn't care about Aelyard wresting control from him. In fact, Lionel hardly resisted against it. Without a medium like the Golden Staff, it took Aelyard far more effort and stamina to succeed. Lionel was happy to let him do it. It only meant that this battle would end all the more quickly. He knew well that the 3 were holding on, hoping that his stamina would run out first. But, was there such a good thing in the world? Unless he was pushed to dire straits, Lionel would never make the mistake of running out of stamina again. As the Battle of Camelot was raging, Lionel didn't have the mind to care for 2 things. First, he had yet to figure out just why it was the dictionary hadn't answered his question, and secondly, the integration was still ongoing. At this time, Earth was undergoing drastic changes. The moon was easily taken for granted. However, the truth was that it was responsible for some of the most important constants of Earth. It could influence the atmosphere, the tides, and even Earth's tilt and rotation. A slight change to any of these things could throw Earth into a heat wave or another ice age. If this was true, what would happen if a second moon suddenly began to form? What would happen to Earth's rotation? Its atmosphere? Its tilt? Its climate? This was exactly what was happening now. Camelot hadn't even fully formed yet, but the chaos had already begun to shift. The first and most obvious change were the tides. On some coasts it completely receded. On others, it surged and began to roll over, forming massive tsunamis that reached into the skies. The climate began to flip and wildly fluctuate, causing massive currents of hot and cold winds to form through the atmosphere. The clashing of these changes soon formed major sites of tornadoes and hurricanes. If one looked toward Earth from space, one would usually find a beautiful blue and green planet that looked somewhat like a polished marble. However, if one looked now, it was almost impossible to see any land at all. Massive white clouds formed large swirling patterns across the skies, masking the disasters they were causing below them. Such massive changes to climate should have occurred over centuries, millennia even. Yet, in this new world order, it all seemed to be happening simultaneously. At this point, everyone had been focused on clearing out as many invalids and zones as possible, all so that a normal society could be rebuilt. But this sudden change caught everyone off guard. At that moment, Emperor Fox stood within Earth's central palace. His hands were clasped behind his back, his flowing white hair whipping about in the surging winds as the sky darkened. His eyes narrowed. He seemed to realize that a massive change was coming even sooner than he anticipated. But he wasn't sure of what this could mean for the future of Earth. They weren't ready for such a change just yet. Within Camelot's world, Lionel had no idea what was happening to Earth at this moment. However, even if he did, there was nothing he could do about it. He had to stay focused on the task at hand. Though he had forced his enemies into a corner and seemingly so easily at that, he still couldn't feel at ease. He seemed to have earned this victory. He knew that there was a limit to how powerful those of higher dimensions could send here. With them being restricted in strength, it shouldn't be shocking that they'd lose to a prepared Lionel. But still, Lionel couldn't shake off the feeling no matter how hard he tried. A unique zone shouldn't be this easily resolved. As Lionel was lost in thought, a figure had begun to stealthily move within the group of individuals he was protecting. Lionel didn't seem to react to this change. In fact, even Arthur and Mordred, who were both elites among elites, didn't sense this change. After a moment, it became obvious why. Not only was this person exceptionally good at hiding their intentions, but they had been standing near Lionel from start to finish. Yet even after several moments of this endless attack of beasts, this person had still not made their move. At that instant, Pope Margrave coughed up a mouthful of blood. He had reached his limit. Sustaining the stamina of two elites was too much even for him despite the support of his treasure. Seeing this, Lionel slightly relaxed. Maybe he was too anxious. There was no way they could have contingency plans for such an event, right? How many could casually control a tide of hundreds of beasts like this? It was exactly then that the shadow within the group acted. Their actions were so swift that even in the instant they were acting, no one reacted to what was happening. The blade was quick, lethal, and merciless. It preyed on the moment Lionel let his guard down like an elite assassin in the night. It charged through the heavy rain, cut through the sharp winds, and aimed for Lionel's back, ready to pierce through his heart. Lionel was finished. Still, even then, the shadow didn't relax. As a professional, until Lionel had breathed his last, celebration would never be on their mind. Beseech you. The blade reached Lionel's back and the shaft of the weapon followed through. The shadow smiled. It was done. A shame, the shadow froze. Had you wielded anything but a spear, you might have had a chance. The indifferent voice continued to drift into the shadow's ears. Isn't that right, Coyote? Chapter 322. Coyote was stunned. It was only after he registered that this eerie voice he was listening to now was Lionel's that he understood that he had failed. However, he couldn't wrap his mind around how he had. His spear had very clearly entered Lionel's body even to the middle of its polearm. How could Lionel possibly be fine? At that moment, Coyote suddenly felt that something was wrong. Though the shaft of his spear had disappeared, he didn't feel the resistance he should after driving his spear through someone. My spear, Coyote was stunned. His spear, its tip had completely crumbled. In fact, even the portion he hadn't tried to drive into Lionel's body began to break down, crumbling into ash before his very eyes. Lionel turned his head back to watch this scene indifferently. It was clear that this was exactly what he expected to happen. To try and use a spear against the owner of the spear domain ring was practically asking for death. Any spear not acknowledged by the ring on Lionel's finger would crumble beneath its influence. Clearly, Coyote hadn't met these lofty goals, so he was destined for failure the moment he stepped forward. Coyote couldn't even react before he felt a blade go through his throat. He was simply too close to Lionel and he had suddenly found himself without a weapon. Why would Lionel give him a chance to recover and escape? He had already flipped his palm and swapped out his spear for an arrow. Coyote could only die with grievances, having no idea how he had ended up in such a situation. Arthur and Mordred looked toward Lionel with shock, not understanding what they were seeing either. However, Lionel didn't have the time to mind their reactions. He had already turned his attention back toward Aelyard and his companions. As expected, the moment Coyote died, their supposedly dire straits had completely flipped. They stood in the midst of the beast tide, coldly locking eyes with Lionel. Lionel couldn't help but shake his head. These people are so cunning and they have no sense of shame. It's as though they put their mission above their pride and dignity. They would rather feign weakness for a chance at easily completing this mission by killing me rather than having an upfront battle. Though it couldn't be said that they were suddenly having an easy time with the beast tide, they were most definitely not on the edge of death as they had made it seem previously. Such a sight made Lionel several points more serious. Just what were they planning now? Margrave, Aelyard said coldly. Yes. In that moment, Margrave's aura completely changed. From one of the holiest, sanctimonious light, it became a boundless darkness, competing even with the vast black clouds in the sky above. Lionel wasn't as shocked by this change as compared to others. Thanks to the fourth trial, he had already seen Pope Margrave use dark elemental magic. However, even he couldn't expect what would happen next. A black pearl appeared in Margrave's hand. He lightly tossed it into the air, causing it to burst apart. This bursting action wasn't an attack, but rather a sort of release, unchaining what was slumbering within. And when Lionel saw exactly what had been within the pearl, he couldn't help but suck in a cold breath. There were 5 individuals in total. All of them had the dull white eyes of invalids, but Lionel knew that they hadn't always been like this because he recognized each and every one of them. They were the members of the Aderna family, Little Nana's family. Lionel's expression changed. If this was the case? His head snapped toward the segmented cube in the distance. From the start, Lionel had veered the battle away from it in order to protect Little Nana. However, if Little Nana's family was being treated like this, the possibility for what could have happened to Little Nana was endless. Come here. Lionel panicked slightly, but he called out as a last resort. He had never tried to command the segmented cube before, but he knew that it was a treasure that had to have its own intelligence even if it was somewhat dormant now. If that wasn't the case, how had it acted on its own to take the octopus corpse before? Or what about when it acted on its own to take the corpse of the naked sniper he crossed paths with after leaving the fort? Aelyard's gaze flashed seeing Lionel's panic. Do it, he said calmly. Before, Aelyard had been apprehensive. He didn't know what kind of treasure the segmented cube was, so he had no idea what might happen if he tried to execute his contingency plan with it acting as a barrier. However, Lionel's panic seemed to put him at ease. Margrave acted on Aelyard's orders almost immediately, sinking into the ground like a shadow. When he reappeared, he had already left the scope of the beast tide, standing before the segmented cube. Lionel's panic grew. The segmented cube actually didn't listen to his command. Could it be that he was wrong about it having intelligence? Could it be that it couldn't hear him? Was there another reason? Lionel's mind spun. He didn't believe for a moment that the Pope hadn't done anything to Little Nana. Judging by the methods of these people, they wouldn't go easy on her just because she was young. After all, even the 2-year-old Mordred hadn't been spared. The only reason why Lionel could trust having Mordred by his side was because he had been there for every one of her so-called treatments. Lionel's mind spun as he forced himself to calm down. Think. The defenses of the segmented cube weren't infallible. Lionel knew this truth firsthand. Back when he awakened his metal synergy lineage factor, he managed to blast a hole right through it. He didn't believe that it could protect itself against an assault from Margrave. Margrave gathered his strength, the darkness around him surging endlessly. Lionel diverted a portion of the beast tide toward him, but he already knew it would be too late to make it. Lionel's gaze suddenly trembled. Place any life forms into suspended animation. His roar shot across the battlefield. At that moment, the segmented cube finally reacted. It spun in place, suddenly shrinking and dodging Margrave's palm. It then shot across the battlefield at an almost impossible-to-track speed, reaching Lionel in the blink of an eye. It was only after the segmented cube landed in Lionel's hand that he finally sighed a breath of relief. However, in the next instant he felt a surge of anger. These people were really damnable. Not even letting a little girl go. Lionel didn't know Little Nana well, but she had already saved his life once. If for nothing other than this favor, he wouldn't let anything happen to her. Beneath his rage, his aura seemed to surge, his violet eyes gaining a slight touch of red. Aelyard slightly frowned at the failure, but it was only that. Looking toward Lionel's rage, he couldn't help but sneer. This boy dared to have such an expression before him? Aelyard stretched out a hand. He had already decided. He would crush this boy with absolute strength and wipe that arrogance between his brow away. It seemed that they had taken his will to end this as easily as possible as a sign of weakness. They would pay dearly for this. His hand continued to raise. At that moment, most of the beast tide was blocked by the 5 Aelyard family puppets Margrave had taken out. But what Aelyard did next would make them nearly obsolete. Bind? He spoke coldly. It was then that it happened. Dozens of beasts were grinded to a halt beneath the might of a single word. Lionel's eyes widened. That ability. It was Little Nana's. Chapter 323. Lionel's gaze went completely red. Within the Joan zone, he had already seen those like Pierre and Nicholas gaining abilities through force arts. They drew these arts directly onto their bodies, gaining power through their pain and sacrifice. However, what Lionel had always understood was that these abilities had to come from someone. He didn't know who they came from, but he knew that this was the only way things made sense. Remembering little Nana's fear when Margrave asked her to come to him, Lionel's fists clenched so tightly that veins threatened to burst along his forearm. Maybe if it wasn't for his impossibly strong physique, that's exactly what would have happened. How exactly had they extracted little Nana's ability from her? What had they put her through? If the pain for just receiving the ability was so great, what was the pain like for snatching an ability? Was little Nana already under their control? Lionel couldn't imagine any other reason they would allow her to roam so freely. The more he thought about it, the more furious he became. The first person that Lionel had ever wanted to kill was the junior Governor Duke. That bastard shot cannons at his own citizens, men, women and children who relied on him for protection. Such scum deserved no less than the worst of deaths. Lionel had never expected that his desire to kill would be unleashed again so soon. As though something constrained within his body was completely released, the muddied ground beneath his feet quaked, sinking in beneath his might. Without a thought for anything else, he placed the segmented cube within his spatial ring and shot forward. Watching his back, Arthur and Mordred looked toward the valiant young man. The halo above his head, the violet bronze aura swirling around his body, his dauntless charge, the father-daughter pair looked toward one another. A swirl of complex emotions lit Arthur's eyes, but to Mordred it was as though she was looking toward just any other person. Mordred smiled somewhat playfully, but it was most definitely not the kind of look one gave to their own father. "I'm going to support him." Without another word, she too shot forward. Arthur looked down at his sword, then toward the corpses of his comrades. He sighed a sigh that seemed to resonate from the depths of his heart. Rain finally fell onto his body, pelting across his valiant white armor and drenching his golden hair. Maybe it was only at that moment he decided to come back to Earth. Then he too charged. Those who had remained in Lionel's circle of protection looked toward each other. They were just an odd mix of humans and demons. The most powerful among them was probably the #1 demon Lord Krakos. They were unsure if they should act as well, but there was truly no choice in the matter. They weren't fools. They felt that if they lost this battle they would regret it for a lifetime. Lionel didn't pay attention to who was coming with him. Maybe it was that he didn't care, or maybe this was the charisma of a king. When a general led a vanguard, did he need to look to his back to ensure his knights were following? When a king entered a room, did he need to check to make sure everyone had bowed? When an emperor looked over a world, did he need make all understand his sovereignty? Lionel didn't need to look. With a flip of his palm, the arrow vanished, being replaced by his black spear. Clang, 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 clang. The sound seemed to resound even more now than they had in the past. It was as though it could feel Lionel's emotions, his valiance, his kingly aura. Lionel appeared before the 5 Aelyard family puppets. But before he could act, he heard a giggle by his ear. "I'll take them on, little one." Lionel didn't look back. His steps suddenly became unpredictable and erratic. Silver skill abrupt stop. Silver skill explosive first step. Gold skill irregular steps. Lionel brushed by the 5 as though they weren't there at all. In that instant, Pierce appeared before him, his 2 long swords blurring into long shadows beneath the falling rain. "Leave him to me." Another voice trailed behind Lionel, carrying a fury no less than his own. Pierce's betrayal was like a knife to King Arthur's heart. He felt like everything he had built as a king was crumbling before him. All the sacrifices he had made, all the tears he had shed, all the blood he had spilt. None of it seemed to matter anymore. He had lost 6 of his brothers. He had long since lost his daughter. His wife was hardly his own. And now, his kingdom was crumbling before his eyes. What did he have left? King Arthur roared beneath the rain. It drenched him from head to toe. He poured his everything into his strike. If he couldn't strike Pierce down today, he would never be able to take a first step. Lionel used Arthur to surge past Pierce, his eyes training on Aelyard. He entered the range of the mental mage, his mind having returned to a state of eerie calm. This was the man who had caused him so much trouble from the very beginning. He was the one who set Lamorak against him. He was the one who caused the death of so many innocents. He was the one who treated the life of a little girl as though she was just expendable cattle. Aelyard's lip curled. "You're courting death." He raised his hand again. "Bind?" Lionel felt formless shackles cover his body. He could tell that these restrictions were many times more powerful than when Nana used them. It might have been because she was still too young, maybe it was because she still had too little understanding of her own ability, or maybe it was because Aelyard's abilities as a mental mage stacked well with Nana's ability. Whatever the truth was, anyone would feel as though it was impossible to break these shackles. Despite controlling a tide of beasts, Aelyard still had plenty of stamina left to deal with Lionel. Die. Lionel's gaze remained expressionless, his eyes boring holes in Aelyard. Clang. 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 The sounds of the chains became more furious. Beneath a king's domain, you dare to be so disrespectful? The words seemed to boom through Aelyard's mind. At that moment, Lionel finally heard the spear's name. In that instant he had finally grasped a portion of his first spear domain. Chain domain. Clang. 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 A dome of black light expanded around Lionel. Across its surface, illusory chains whipped about like vines and whips, resonating with the rumbling thunder above. The binding restrictions Aelyard placed down suddenly found themselves being ironically restricted. In the blink of an eye they weakened by more than half. With a flex of his body, Lionel shattered them, landing on the ground. His hair billowed wildly as he stepped toward Aelyard, a halo of violet bronze hanging above his head. Aelyard's calm expression finally cracked. But to Lionel his reaction didn't mean a thing. He had come to kill. Chapter 324. Lionel's momentum was stifling. It felt as though the whole world was bowing down to him, as though everything within his reach was his own domain. Domain? Aelyard was so shocked by what he was seeing that he didn't know what to say. Lionel was simply too ignorant of the way of this new world order. Oftentimes, he couldn't properly grasp how his own abilities compared to others and just how valuable some of the resources he had available to him were. As such, he had no way of knowing just how rare domain abilities were or just how powerful they were. The so-called light domain couldn't truly be considered such an ability. Though it had helped Lionel understand the framework of what a domain should be, light domain could only be considered a cheap imitation. A domain, no matter what kind it was, represented sovereignty, a dominion, an area of absolute control. In order for one to comprehend a domain, one must be of the king's path. However, not only did Lionel not know this, he had no idea what a king's path was to begin with. This couldn't be considered to be Lionel's fault. At Earth's current level, it wasn't worthy of coming into contact with such a thing. In fact, even fourth-dimensional worlds and most fifth-dimensional worlds would never come into contact with such a thing. Even if there was a child with such abilities born into such a world, their talents would more than likely go completely unnoticed. Understanding the king's path wasn't just about having the ability, it was also about being of high enough standing to learn about it to begin with. And even then the so-called king's path was just the tip of the iceberg. With all of this said, it was thus shocking that Aelyard was even aware of the existence of such a thing. And the truth of the matter was that he wasn't. He had no idea what the king's path was. The reason his reaction was like this was only because he had a small bit of knowledge about domains, and this small amount of knowledge was already enough for him to shiver in fear. Lionel, however, didn't care about Aelyard's reaction. To him, having a domain wasn't a big deal. This chain domain was just one of hundreds of domains he could comprehend. In fact, it was among the very weakest. With such a perspective, how could Lionel realize the kind of treasure trove he was sitting on? All he cared about was burying Aelyard. Bang! Lionel shot forward. At that moment, Aelyard felt as though he was moving through quicksand. He felt a weight on his body that seemed beyond simple gravity. It was as though limiters had been placed on his body, not allowing him to display his full potential. Aelyard forced himself to calm down. Even though this was a mighty domain, it had its own weaknesses. It was clear that it was still very immature. For one, even though this was a restriction-type domain, it could only work on the physical body. It had little impact on his spirit pressure or the mage arts he could cast. The only unfortunate part was the little Nana's ability only worked on the physical for now as well, which meant that within this domain, it was impossible to use this ability against Lionel. Still, after thinking to this point, Aelyard had already calmed down completely. The range of Lionel's domain was only about 10 meters currently. This meant that he couldn't stop Aelyard from continuing to bind the beasts. As long as the beasts couldn't interfere, he didn't believe he couldn't deal with an immature brat. At that moment, the ground before Lionel turned into a shadow, quickly manifesting Margrave, who had returned to protect Aelyard. Lionel didn't seem fazed by this, he had already been prepared. It was impossible to expect Mordred to stop both a group of 5 elites and Margrave at the same time. From the moment Lionel stepped onto this battlefield, he was prepared to face the both of them at once. Margrave immediately realized that his physical speed had been limited by Lionel's chain domain. However, he reacted quickly, surging with dark elemental force. It was clear in an instant that his strength in the dark element far surpassed his skill in the light element. Shadow-like tendrils shot up from the ground, shooting toward Lionel. At the same time, Aeliard's eyes flashed, manifesting numerous invisible drills that pierced toward Lionel's mind. Lionel charged forward as though he couldn't sense the danger. A sinister light flashed within Aeliard's eyes. He wasn't surprised by this result. This was the same fool who couldn't even block a simple mental agitation spell just a couple months ago. It was impossible for him to be able to see through the intricacies of mental mage magic already. Lionel's spear swept forward, a strong spear force and light coating its tip. It slashed apart Margrave's attack as though it was formed of tissue paper, allowing him to close in on the former pope in the blink of an eye. Margrave felt the restrictions coating his body. He couldn't move as he willed, and even if he could, how could he, a lifelong mage, match Lionel's speed? Shadow Shield. Numerous triangular curved shield appeared between Lionel and Margrave. Though Lionel shattered the first 2 with absolute ease, the third and subsequent fourth slowed his steps greatly. It seemed as though his momentum would come to a grinding halt at that very moment. It was then that Aeliard's invisible attack entered Lionel's range. If one could look into the world of a mental mage, it looked as though 6 cone-shaped drills were spinning toward Lionel, each more sinister than the last. One was even directed right toward Lionel's brainstem, looking to kill him with a single lethal strike. The strike seemed inevitable. Even as Lionel shattered the last of Margrave's defenses and closed in on the man, the latter was relaxed as though he could already see Lionel's corpse. However, it was at that moment that Lionel's eyes closed and reopened. It seemed like it occurred in but a moment, just a singular split moment. In fact, if the 2 men didn't know better, they would think that Lionel had simply blinked. But there was no mistaking the sudden change to the air. Ack! Aeliard held onto his head, shrieking in pain. Even when he closed his eyes in an attempt to escape, he couldn't shake the sight of those 2 predatory eyes boring into his mind. Chapter 325. Lionel didn't seem to hear Aeliard's cry of pain. He had already closed in the distance to Margrave. Darkness due. Light domain. Lionel's indifferent voice cut through it all. The original creator of Light Domain didn't spend years of research constructing this spell so that it could enhance light elemental arts. Though it worked out this way, it could only be considered a mere afterthought, an unexpected position outcome. The main reason it was created wasn't to boost the light, but to restrain the dark. Lionel could tell that the reason Margrave was so good with the dark element was because it wasn't a simple affinity. Lionel was certain that manipulation of darkness was Margrave's ability, not much unlike the little mink. However, even still, Light Domain directly suppressed his ability to converge the dark element. It was just a small delay. But, in a battle of such intensity, especially when Margrave had already been caught off guard by Lionel's counterattack once, did he really stand another chance? An image of a valiant man with a mane-like beard appeared in Lionel's mind. He was a man with an indomitable spear, one that could pierce through all things. The first time Lionel used this man's consciousness in battle, he had been using a wooden spear. But even then he deformed a heavily reinforced shield and sent a shield man flying. It was that will that manifested again. A man with a single spear facing the whole world. Even though it looked like a simple pierce, it felt as though even if there was a mountain before Lionel, he would shatter it. Beseech you. Margrave looked down at his chest with an incredulous expression. What shocked him wasn't the fact Lionel's spear had gone through him. In fact, it was the fact Lionel's spear hadn't targeted him at all that left him stunned. Lionel's spear ran through a seemingly inconspicuous shadow on the ground. Yet, Margrave felt as though his chest had been run through and his life was quickly escaping him. How? Lionel's gaze carried an undying sharpness. It was as though he had used the universe itself as his whetstone. How many times do you think the same trick will work on me? How much longer did you plan on feigning weakness? Since you don't seem to take me seriously, just die. Margrave's mouth spluttered with blood, his face painted with an incredulous expression as he slowly fell over. It seems that you never fell for it at all, right? Margrave died with grievances. His shadow heart was one of his greatest trump cards. He had no idea how Lionel had seen through it. But even worse than that, Lionel had never fallen for his weakness ploy even once, even if one considered Coyote's sneak attack. So, why did he sound like the one who had suffered the loss? Lionel pulled his spear from the ground, walking by Margrave's corpse as he slowly approaching Aeliard's writhing figure. This time he didn't allow the eyes of his snowy star owl to fade. If it wasn't for it, he really would have fallen for Margrave's ploy and likely suffered a loss. Seeing how cunning these people were, he no longer dared to lower his guard. For individuals like this, he had every intention of remaining cautious to the very end. Lionel stood 1.5 meters from the screaming Aeliard, leveling out his spear until it hung just before the man's forehead. "The bishop, who is he?" Lionel asked coldly. Aeliard continued to writhe in pain as though he couldn't hear Lionel's words. In the distance, the battle between Arthur and Pierce was reaching a climax. But it was clear that King Arthur's legend wasn't for show. He had gained a slight upper hand, and if given enough time, Lionel felt that victory would be his. If Lionel turned back now, the battle would be as good as over. As for Mordred, she was even freer. She had gained support from the other demons and humans early on, giving her the easiest task. In addition, it seemed like Margrave's control over the 5 members of the Aderna family collapsed. Chain. The moment Lionel's judgment descended, Aeliard found himself wrapped in countless illusory chains. It seemed that whatever tricks they had completely collapsed. This time Lionel really had been too cautious. He had underestimated the kind of effect his snowy star owl lineage factor could have. If it wasn't because Aeliard's comprehension of mental mage arts was so far beyond Lionel, his mind would have been directly shattered. Lionel's palm flipped, causing a snow globe to appear in his hand. Aeliard seemed to finally react to this sudden change. He tried to shift backward, but the chains that bound him made him look no different from a pitifully escaping worm. Lionel shot a kick forward, clipping his chin and knocking him out completely. Only after Aeliard had been trapped within a state of suspended animation did he sigh a breath of relief. He didn't know if he could extract any information out of Aeliard, but what he did know was that he couldn't continue to remain in the dark like this. Lionel turned back, only to find Mordred and King Arthur dealing a final blow to Pierce. A breath he didn't know he had been holding was finally released. Were things really over now? It seems that Nana's family hadn't died, they were just taking control of... Lionel had thought that Margrave was a necromancer, but it seemed like that wasn't the case. Or maybe they had only kept Nana's family alive so that it was easier to control her. If that's true, it's likely that whoever can extract abilities and copy them to others needs their subject to be alive. Lionel made the only conclusion he could with such limited information. It was clear that this bishop valued Nana's ability even compared to others. This was ultimately a good thing for Lionel. He had so many enemies already, maybe being a friend to a hidden family wouldn't be a bad thing. Still, he didn't get ahead of himself. He had seen no lack of ungrateful people in this new world order. Who knew if the Aderna family would appreciate his help? A wave of fatigue assaulted Lionel. His nerves really had been stretched too thin for too long. He shook his head, knowing that it still wasn't time for him to rest. Lionel slowly trudged toward the sinkhole, focused entirely on the massive spherical force art that loomed above it. Even compared to the one within his dream world, it was massive. No matter how Lionel looked at it, he had no idea how to take advantage of this thing. And even though he was right before it, he had no idea why it was those higher dimensional beings wanted it so much. It was impossible for Lionel to copy it with his dream sculpt ability. Last time, he had relied on the enlightenment given by the maturing force core to succeed. Not to mention the fact there was no such boost here, even if there was, with how much more complicated this art was, there was no guarantee he would succeed before his stamina ran out. Lionel sighed. What is this? And how do I take advantage of it? As usual, Lionel tried to rely on the dictionary. But his expression changed once again when he didn't get an answer. Was this thing broken? What was happening? Lionel frowned. If the dictionary was really broken, this was too big of a loss. Maybe. Lionel's palm flipped over and another snow globe appeared. He looked from the snow globe to the sinkhole and spherical force art before him. Won't know unless I try. Chapter 326. Worst? Lionel brought the snow globe forward, hoping to see some sort of tangible change. But he was quickly disappointed. The large, complex and spherical force art didn't budge even a bit. Lionel shook his head. He couldn't even look at this force art directly without feeling a splitting headache, but now he couldn't even store it away. Suddenly thinking of something, Lionel began to search the bodies of Aylard, Margrave and Pierce. There had to be a clue on their bodies about what their plans for this force art actually was. King Arthur watched this scene as though he was hesitating to say something. A part of him wanted to say that these treasures should be split. If he did say so, he wouldn't necessarily be in the wrong. After all, he did participate in the battle and he did alleviate the pressure Lionel had been feeling. So, compared to some other shameless individuals, he would have more of a right to speak of such things. However, a part of him wanted to hold back. He didn't know why, but he felt as though saying something like this would be inappropriate. Lionel continued to search through their bodies as though nothing was happening. It was only after finding a few spatial treasures that he looked up toward this king that seemed to be just a shell of his former self. Arthur felt somewhat uncomfortable beneath the gaze of Lionel. Didn't say anything for a long while. But Arthur was ultimately a king. His deeply ingrained pride didn't allow him to look away. Suddenly Lionel smiled. "Your Majesty, did you forget that there are countless treasures floating around? What are you standing around for? Do you want them all to disappear first?" Lionel's words suddenly snapped everyone out of their stupor and absent-mindedness. Due to the harsh weather and the subsequent battle, everyone had forgotten that the initial spark for everything were the force art skills and the treasures of Merlin's trials. The dark skies and rushing rain made it too easy to miss the floating treasures in the air. They could hardly see their hands right before their faces. Arthur was stunned for a moment before he laughed and shook his head. Instead of heading toward the treasures as everyone expected, he slowly walked toward the bodies of his fallen brothers and kneeled by their sides, falling into silence. Sometimes actions spoke louder than words. And in this case, Arthur's actions spoke the loudest. No one knew what would happen to Camelot. The weather had only been growing worse and the rumbling of the ground had never stopped. In fact, it was only growing more intense. In such a situation, Arthur was actually still thinking about treasures. Even he found himself to be laughable. It was impossible for a person to change in an instant of time. But it seemed possible for someone to take a first step. Arthur placed Pierce's head before his brother's, falling into silence. Lionel watched this scene from afar and didn't say much. Mordred's gaze flashed for but a moment before returning to normal. She seemed more interested in Lionel than anyone else. "Everyone," Lionel spoke. "I want hog everything. You can rely on your own abilities to snatch the treasures that remain. But, since there are so few of you remaining, I hope there won't be any more killing. The future is still uncertain right now, so do your best to preserve yourselves." Lionel knew that the integration with Earth's fold of reality definitely wouldn't be smooth. Though this situation was much better than it could have been. Since Camelot was appearing with its own land and resources, it wouldn't be encroaching on Earth, at least not immediately. But who knew how long that would last? As things stood now, Lionel didn't feel any sort of special attachment to Earth, and he definitely didn't have one for Camelot. He just hoped they wouldn't massacre one another to the last man. With those words said, Lionel turned his attention back to the rings in his hands, completely ignoring the gaze of Monet and Violet Rain. It was no surprise that they both believed that his words were targeted at them, but what could they do about it? Lionel had made his stance clear, and he also made it very obvious that he was the most powerful individual here. Monet's gaze narrowed. "I stand no chance against him. Unless the fourth dimension descends, it'll remain like this. Every would cause an overall evolution of its world and people." Monet felt that even with the strength of her ability, she would need it to evolve again for her to stand a chance against Lionel. But, by then, wouldn't Lionel's ability also evolve? The variables were too many and the future was too difficult to read. Whether or not she would succeed in surpassing Lionel when that time came was still questionable. Lionel, however, had no intention of letting those he had already surpassed threaten him in the future. "There's nothing in here," Lionel frowned. Within Margrave's spatial ring, the most important thing he found were crystals that held various dark elemental spells. This was technically a good thing. Though Lionel had no intention of using them himself, he could use perfect union to transfer these skills to the little mink and allow the little guy to slowly gain more control over his own abilities. However, even if it was good, it wasn't what Lionel wanted to find. Ayllard's ring was even more useless to him. It contained more sinister mental mage spells than what Lionel could find within the Mage Academy, but other than that, there was nothing. Lionel's frown deepened because Pierce's ring was even more useless to him. It contained sword techniques and he obviously didn't wield a sword. The truth was that Lionel was less off-put by the fact he couldn't find anything than by what the fact he couldn't find anything meant. All of this meant that he once again couldn't see through the purpose of the bishop and his fanatics. And this was a worst-case scenario. Chapter 327. Lionel could only shake his head as he threw Aeliard back into a state of suspended animation. There was a mind-scouring technique within Aeliard's possession. There were many sinister techniques within Aeliard's possession. Among them there was a technique by the name of mind search. It was a technique that left the target pretty much brain dead. However, Lionel didn't dare to use this technique so freely, and especially not against Aeliard. The backlash for failing was even worse than being the target of such a technique. Without enough assurance in his own skill he couldn't. After my soul force evolves to use fourth-dimensional force, he'll learn the technique and use it on Aeliard. Only then would I have 100% assurance. Lionel was satisfied with his choice to remain cautious. However, being cautious now wouldn't help him with the current situation. By now, many of the elites who had remained began to discuss how to split the treasures. It was quite shocking. If others of Camelot knew that demons and humans were discussing things with their words and not their blades, who knows how they would react. Lionel tried the dictionary again, but it still remained silent. A sigh escaped his lips. Maybe I should focus on gathering the legendary skills. This world doesn't seem like it'll stay in this state for much longer. Though it seemed like everyone was casual, the only reason they weren't running around panicking was because of their elite statuses. They weren't common folk, they knew that no matter what was happening, they needed strength to overcome it. In addition, there was no use in rushing back to Camelot or the Demon Empire. By the time they got there, everything would have likely been set in stone. So, why not stay here and benefit? There's one thing I still haven't tried. Lionel thought to himself, flipping his palm to reveal the segmented cube. Lionel had realized something. Whenever the segmented cube swallowed something, it would separate into its jigsaw puzzles and envelop it. Then, when Lionel entered, whatever it swallowed would magically be within one of the snow globes. Who knows, maybe it could help him out now. Help me out a bit, will you? Lionel asked in a somewhat pleading tone. This force art was too important to him. Lionel suspected that this force art, the one in his dream world, and others like it could boost the comprehension speed of whoever wielded it. How else could he have comprehended his healing branch in such a perilous moment? If this was true, the benefits would be nearly infinite. He couldn't bring himself to leave it behind even if there were other treasures to be had here. The segmented cube suddenly whirred to life, causing Lionel's eyes to widen with expectation. It spun on Lionel's palm for a moment before shooting forward through the rain. It expanded to hundreds of meters in width in the blink of an eye, separating into countless little jigsaw puzzles. The others watched on in shock but didn't say anything. They could tell that there was something frightening above the sinkhole just based on instinct. But most of them couldn't even see it. And those who could only do so for a moment before their minds were split apart by a blinding headache. Clearly, they weren't qualified to benefit from whatever this thing was. When the segmented cube returned to Lionel's hands, he smiled brightly, a weight finally being taken off of his shoulders. Though his mind was still too weak to comprehend this force art now, if he found another opportunity like he did within the Force Crystal Mine, the benefits would be unimaginable. Feeling relaxed, Lionel finally turned his attention to other things and began to pick out legendary skills. Lionel realized during this process that fusing with these skills wasn't so simple. If he wanted to make them his own, he would have to draw them into his dream world with his dream sculpt ability just like he had for the mage arts he learned. But Lionel didn't mind this. For one, thanks to this, he was able to find the spear legendary skill he lost to Coyote floating above his body after his death. Clearly, Coyote hadn't managed to make it his own. And secondly, this meant that compared to others he had a great advantage. Who knew how many years of meditation it would take the others to comprehend their own legendary skills? As for Lionel, he felt that a few weeks and a couple months at most would be enough for him to finish dream sculpting one. Within a few years he would have finished with them all. Still, this made Lionel realize just how magical Merlin's world was. Somehow, with the use of skill points, star points and slaughter points, he managed to make the process instantaneous. This level of skill was far beyond Lionel's comprehension and something he could only look up to. But, at the same time, Lionel felt like the secret to allowing this was within the fourth-dimensional force art he had used the help of the segmented cube to take. Lionel managed to find the remaining 3 legendary skills for his bow and the one ultimate skill that helped fuse them. Then he repeated this task for the spear. He originally planned to stop there, but when he found the ultimate skill for his spear, he stumbled across the summer legendary skill for fists. There's no one here who relies on fist techniques. Remembering his time with Heckle and the boxing techniques he learned, Lionel smiled and decided to snatch the 4 legendary and one ultimate skill for fists as well. Who knows, it might come in handy one day. Lionel's heart felt light. Though the trip to this zone had been dangerous, he had benefited a lot. Aina? Lionel looked up toward the rumbling skies. It seemed like the apex of this transformation was coming. With its conclusion, Lionel knew that his zone quests would end as well. Lionel. A sudden voice snapped him out of his thoughts. He turned to see that it was Krakos, the #1 demon lord. Yes? Lionel asked. Choose. Krakos' words were blunt and without flowery wastes of breath. His voice itself, despite his massive size, actually sounded quite scholarly and soft, though. It was quite an interesting contrast. Lionel looked toward what was in Krakos' hands only to find numerous floating treasures, all of which had been trapped within spatial dimensions. Oh. Lionel's gaze lit up. I want stand on ceremony then? Lionel smiled and took a familiar necklace. It seemed that the treading goddess necklace would still fall into his hands in the end. At that moment, the feverish rumbling of the world reached a peak. The sound of shattering glass reverberated through all their ears. Then everything went black. Chapter 328. Earth shook and quaked. At that moment, a second moon appeared in the sky. But, compared to the silvery beauty that was the original, this one was bathed in blackness, making it exceptionally difficult to pick out in the night sky. The result was an even more violent change to Earth's climate. It was impossible to tell exactly what would happen and just when these changes would come to an end. That said, these things had little to do with Lionel. Lionel's vision blurred. When it finally cleared once more, he found himself in a familiar white space. One would think the first thing Lionel would do would be to rush forward and demand the treasures he had earned. But instead he collapsed to the ground, taking deep steady breaths. These past few months had truly been too hard. Even though only a week or so had passed in the real world, to him, it had been over a year. His 19th birthday was also quickly approaching within this true timeline. He looked up toward the endless vastness of white and smiled. He didn't know why he did, but he just felt like he should. How long are you going to lie there? Lionel grinned, hearing the familiar voice. Just a bit longer, Uncle Montez. Lionel mumbled. Eventually Lionel sat up. Seeing the boy finally move, Montez wanted to admonish him about the time limit of this place again, but he seemed stunned to see Lionel's current state. The current Lionel looked practically like a beggar. His clothes were torn and caked in blood, mud and rain. It was as though he had spent several years on a battlefield and only just came out. In fact, this wasn't even that far from the truth. Still, what shocked Montez even more was Lionel's hair color. Despite the state of the rest of his body, Lionel's hair seemed untouched and unblemished. It didn't even have the slightest speck of dust on it. After a moment, Montez hid his shock and shook his head. You look like a mess. Lionel's grin didn't fade. Well, your nephew here suffered quite a lot in the past few months. Montez laughed. I can see that. Without another word, Montez took out a scroll and unfurled it. The moment he did, his playful demeanor vanished. In silence, he read the details of the zone and what Lionel went through. When he finally looked up, he couldn't decide whether this boy had heaven-defying good luck or bad luck. The first time he entered a zone, he accidentally cleared a 4-person subdimensional zone on his own. The second time he entered a zone, it nearly became a unique zone. And the third time he entered, the worries from the second zone became reality. You cleared a unique zone? Lionel shrugged. I was a bit lucky. Montez didn't refute this. Unique zones weren't a joke. Sometimes, they could be more difficult to clear than zones several levels above them in difficulty. It could only be said that Lionel was lucky that Earth was still a pseudo-fourth-dimensional world. If not for this, he would likely be dead. What did you do with the Aderna family members? Montez asked. Lionel rubbed his nose. They're in a safe place. Montez looked toward Lionel for a while before bursting out into a fit of laughter. He already understood what Lionel was doing. If he just released the Aderna family, he'd have to split the reward. But, if he kept them within the suspended animation state, they would still be considered dead until all of this ended. That way, he'd be able to monopolize more treasures. He didn't feel bad about this at all. If not for him, they really would be dead. Plus, what they didn't know wouldn't hurt them. What are the rewards for clearing a unique zone like Uncle Montez? Lionel's eyes sparkled. Lionel was actually quite excited. The better the treasures were, the easier time he'd have in finding Aina. He didn't know what happened a few days ago, but he suddenly felt that she was in trouble. This sort of feeling left him anxious. Though he had buried it to now, he was all too eager to make his way to Terrain. However, Lionel didn't expect his question to make Montez solemn once more. What is it? Lionel probed. Don't tell me you're going to cheat me again? Montez sighed. It's nothing like that. It's just that the logistics around rewards for unique zones are a bit special. Montez shook his head. Forget it, I will give you your options, but don't take out your anger on me. I'm innocent. Lionel frowned. What was Montez trying to say? There are two paths for you to take. If you assess this normally, you can gain rewards as if this was a Tier 9 black zone. That way, all your rewards will take a single step up. Lionel's frown deepened. This wasn't because he didn't like what he had just heard, but because he felt that this was very fair, great, even. But if Montez was reacting like this, that means that this wasn't fair at all. This sort of reality left Lionel feeling uncomfortable all over. It was as though his ignorance was being used to prey on him. If not for Uncle Montez being on his side in this matter, maybe he would have continued to be ignorant. The second option is to hand in all the evidence you gained of the unique zone over. Should you choose to do this, your rewards will gain another massive boost. Not only will this zone be treated as a Tier 9 black zone, but you can also pick out a true bronze-grade treasure of any tier. Lionel abruptly stood from the ground, his gaze flashing. Montez was a bit stunned by Lionel's momentum, but he remained expressionless, silently waiting for Lionel's choice. They want to bribe me to cover this up? Lionel sneered. It seemed the longer he spent in this world, the more garbage he unearthed. Chapter 329. Montez didn't say anything in response to Lionel. There was no such thing as absolute fairness in this world. The only reason so many worlds had come together to provide rewards to Earth for their progress in clearing zones was because they saw Earth's potential. There were plenty of other pseudo-fourth-dimensional worlds that didn't even qualify to gain such treatment. In addition, this system exposed the underbelly of something far more sinister. For these worlds to so casually hand out such treasures to a fledgling world, how much could they really care about such treasures? Lionel couldn't help but laugh inwardly. He and everyone else on Earth were doing all they could to earn these rewards, but weren't these just the scraps left behind by higher worlds who couldn't bother with them anymore? To those lofty beings, what were black and bronze treasures to them? They might not even bend down to pick up a silver-grade treasure off the side of the road. Yet here he was, jumping like a monkey for them. Lionel's rage slowly calmed. What point was there in being angry? He had to clear these zones one way or another for the sake of saving his home world. Even though he didn't have many positive emotions toward the current Earth, this still remained true. Since they wanted to give him their scraps, he would accept them for now. But he would remember this. No thanks. Lionel said calmly. He'll be keeping the evidence to myself. Montez's gaze sparkled slightly. Are you sure? Such a choice came with its own consequences. But Montez was sure that Lionel didn't need this explained to him. This would most definitely place a target on Lionel's back. Not only this, but whatever organization, world or entity that had deemed to act against Earth this time would most definitely be thoroughly offended. Lionel had already ruined their long, well-laid-out plans. If he also didn't know when to take a step back and insisted on pursuing this matter, there would be no repairing such a relationship. I'm sure. Lionel said casually, having already thrown this matter to the back of his head. He almost died not once but twice. In addition to this, these people wanted the resources he rightfully fought to earn. Yet they wanted to lower his head and accept this trade? Though Uncle Montez had only said the word evidence, Lionel knew it implied that they also wanted to take the fourth-dimensional force art from him. And to think they wanted to trade a measly bronze-grade treasure for it? Lionel's couldn't help but sneer inwardly. He was pissed. All right, brat. That's enough of that. You're scaring your uncle making such a face. Montez smiled, heavily patting Lionel's shoulder as though greatly satisfied. But that minor action made Lionel feel as though a mountain was landing on him. He could only smile bitterly just how much more powerful than himself was Montez. Now your rewards. This will be designated as a Tier 9 black zone, so the rewards will be distributed as such. They will be split 3 ways, 1 portion to you. Lionel nodded. He had left Monet and Violet Rain alone, so he had already expected as much. For clearing the main quest of saving King Arthur, you'll receive 4 Tier 9 black treasures. You failed to clear the side quests, whether that was to kill Mordred or solve the love triangle, though you made some progress on the harder of the two. So no rewards for this. However, you managed to clear the most difficult mission and made Camelot a part of true history. Montez raised an eyebrow when he said this. It seemed that this wasn't so simple. Uncle Montez, what exactly does that mean? What changes will happen? Well, Montez hesitated. The main benefit is the accelerated maturation of Earth. Originally, it should have taken a few more decades for the fourth dimension to descend. But this will happen much sooner, another few years at most. Lionel fell into his thoughts. He didn't know if this was necessarily a good thing. Another important change you should consider is the change to overall history. This will cause unique changes to Earth's history and by extension your zones to appear. It will become more difficult to rely on your understanding of history to clear zones now. Montez shook his head. Lionel felt like he wanted to say more, but he was clearly bound by something. Lionel had already gotten used to this. Montez had been like this from the very beginning. Anyway, due to the uniqueness of this hidden quest, the rewards are likewise better than they would usually be. You can gain 3 quasi-bronze treasures. Lionel took a deep breath. To go from a potential reward of true bronze treasures to quasi-ones didn't feel great, but he could only accept it. Plus, bronze treasures were considered fifth-dimensional treasures. There was no shame in not having them. In fact, there were many in fourth-dimensional worlds that couldn't even own a Tier 7 black treasure, let alone a quasi-bronze one. It was only a matter of perspective. Not only were there many worlds who couldn't even gain this level of support from higher dimensional worlds, even in those that did, how many could clear zones as difficult as the ones Lionel had? In addition, in fourth-dimensional worlds, they had to deal with fifth-dimensional zones. Any fourth-dimensional rewards they had gained in the past were now family heirlooms only passed on to the most worthy or the most talented. As for the rewards from fifth-dimensional zones, how could they be so easily grasped? How many could even try to take on such a zone, let alone claim the rewards from them? Lionel wasn't aware of such things, but he still easily accepted the reality before him. There'd come a day where these lofty beings wouldn't be able to look down on him any longer. The first light of ambition lit within Lionel's heart. Maybe even he, himself, hadn't realized it quite yet, but all of his experiences to this point had been slowly building to this point. From a boy without aim or goals, he was slowly forming his own path. Chapter 330. 4 Tier 9 Black Treasures and 3 Quasi-Bronze Treasures. Lionel already knew what he would use his first Tier 9 Black Treasure on, he didn't even need to think about it. So, he could be considered to have 6 choices to make. Should I choose treasures that will make my 10th node easier to form? Lionel felt that he was at a point now where he could finally attempt to follow through on his crazy idea. He remembered that there was a point in time he thought that he would need to form his 10th node before he could battle Lamorak. But now he realized that he had severely underestimated himself, so he was quite curious about just how powerful he would become. I'm not lacking in force, I still have the stalactite drippings from the hive. Force is probably what I lack the least of. Lionel still had many treasures he had gained from the hive that he had yet to use. For example, his mellow dew stalactites. They formed a drop of dew that contained an incredibly high density of force every so often. They were perfect for a final push of force when needed. Uncle Montez, if I want the rest of dimensional cleanse, what do I have to do? Montez's gaze flashed for a moment. When he scanned Lionel up and down, he was shocked again. You already formed the 2-star constitution? Lionel didn't really know how to respond to this. The creator of Dimensional Cleanse had always said that it would be difficult, but Lionel never struggled with it, so he never thought it was a big deal at all. Is that very difficult? Lionel asked. I think the creator was exaggerating, my stars always formed right after reaching the node requirement. I don't feel a bottleneck for forming the 3rd star either. Montez gave Lionel a weird look, but in the end he kept his words to himself. Lionel apparently had no idea that oftentimes, one would wait to complete the foundation of Dimensional Cleanse entirely before forming one's stars. Montez had never heard of it being so easy for someone that their stars formed automatically. In addition, those who practiced Dimensional Cleanse weren't normally people of Lionel's level. And by level, that would refer to how low his world was on the dimensional rankings. Montez sighed and shook his head. It's impossible for you to trade for later portions of Dimensional Cleanse with your current rewards. The next part is worth at least a Tier 9 bronze reward. Of course, if you change your mind and hand in the evidence. Lionel's expression darkened, but his silence made his stance clear. He had no intention of doing this. Then what about information for where to find the later portions? Lionel still remembered the introduction Montez had given him, even though it felt like a lifetime ago. Aside from treasures, it was possible to buy information as well. It was just that Lionel never thought he would waste one of his rightfully earned treasures on such a thing. But he was also aware of just how important Dimensional Cleanse was to him. It seemed that even though Montez could bend the rules slightly, he couldn't break them. So this was the only choice Lionel had left. Montez's smile deepened at these words. It will cost one of your quasi-bronze treasures. Lionel nearly stumbled. Information was this expensive? Who the hell was playing a joke on him right now because it wasn't very funny? Lionel clenched his jaw. He would definitely remember this moment. Alright, I'll trade. When Lionel spoke, the magic counter reappeared once again. When it stopped flashing, all that was left was a singular piece of beautifully polished metal. It was incredibly flat and had an almost oval shape. Lionel almost immediately recognized the metal. There were many ways of storing information in the universe. The crystals of Camelot were one way and this metal represented another. Compared to the crystal of Camelot, memory ore could store millions if not trillions of times more information. Memory ore was able to store and memorize fluctuations of force and inscribe it onto its chemical structure. The issue with memory ore, though, was that it was incredibly difficult to use. And, although somewhat less so, it was also incredibly difficult to read. Only those with high control of their soul force could cause the subtle changes needed to jot down information. And, likewise, only those with exceptional sensitivity in the soul force could detect these changes. As such, memory ore wasn't only useful for holding information, but it was a symbol of skill and status. On top of this, it had the greatest ratio of surface area to memory capacity in the whole of the universe. The moment Lionel saw this, he realized that Uncle Montez was helping him out again. There were many things Lionel was ignorant of, but metals and ores were one thing he was most definitely not. Memory ore alone, disregarding the information within it, was considered a seventh-dimensional item. Lionel shouldn't even be allowed to come into contact with such a thing, let alone exchanging a mere quasi-bronze treasure for it. Lionel took a deep breath and gave Montez a look, but the latter stared back as though nothing was wrong. What, you don't want the information anymore? Regretting it? Lionel almost couldn't refrain from rolling his eyes. With his current level of skill, it was impossible for him to read the information on this memory ore again. However, even if it would take him 100 years to do so, it would be worth it. Who could just casually trade for a seventh-dimensional item? I'll take it, Lionel said solemnly. And I'll remember this. He spoke these words within his heart. There was no need to say them out loud. He didn't know why Montez had helped him out so much since he had come to know him, but by this point, Lionel didn't care. There would come a day where he would repay the favor. Chapter 331. Lionel carefully put this memory ore away. He didn't know what information it held and he didn't even attempt to read it. If he was too careless, he might disrupt the chemical structure of the ore and destroy the information on it. So he didn't dare to. Of course, this was just Lionel being overly cautious. His current strength couldn't even elicit a reaction from the ore, let alone destroy the information on it. But, regardless, he wouldn't be able to read it now. And, since Uncle Montez wasn't helping him to read it, it was clear that he was unworthy of knowing this information just yet. The bad news was that this meant that Lionel couldn't progress far into the fourth dimension for a long while, at least until he could read the contents of this ore again. However, there was still good news. After all, Lionel now had a path to finding the rest of Dimensional Cleanse. And he had a good feeling that whatever it is he found would be better than what the Tier 9 bronze reward would have given him. In addition, though Lionel couldn't strengthen himself the conventional way, there were still many other ways for him to do so. For one, there was his ability. Secondly, there was the Four Seasons realm. And thirdly, there was still his soul force, which had vast rooms for improvement. Thinking to this point, Lionel suddenly felt he had a direction to move in. Thanks to Camelot fusing with Earth's fold of reality, he still had his bow and even his quiver. By Lionel's estimation, his bow was a quasi-bronze treasure as well that he had yet to get the full potential out of, so there was no need to change it. After all, he still couldn't even pull the string to a full moon. As for the quiver, though it was still silver and the equivalent of a tier 6 or 7 treasure, it was serviceable and Lionel didn't feel a need to waste one of his picks on it. After that, one might think Lionel would choose a defensive treasure. But Lionel didn't feel like this was necessary. Not only would he soon have the skill he needed to reward his quasi-bronze chain necklace, thanks to his absorption of herb ore, his body was already about to break past the standard stage. Defense was the least of his worries. Uncle Montez, I'd like a movement technique of the quasi-bronze level, preferably something that matches well with my snowy star owl lineage factor. Montez's gaze flashed once again. So he's awakened this as well already? Lionel had decided long ago to go with this route. After he saw the strength of movement techniques thanks to Merlin's trials, He knew he needed something like this very soon. Montez clapped his hands and the counter began to flash. The light element was rare to begin with. In addition, the snowy star owl was well known for its speed. In fact, the speed branch was the only branch awakening Lionel hadn't completed till now. This was all to say that the number of techniques that met Lionel's requirements were pitifully few, even fewer than the number of techniques he had to pick from when he chose Dimensional Cleanse. Still, much like when he chose Dimensional Cleanse, Lionel felt one calling out to him the moment he laid eyes on it. He didn't even feel the need to look at the others. Gold Feather Step. Even without opening the cover, Lionel knew that this was the one. He could faintly feel that it was separated into 3 different kinds of steps. One projected into his mind like a bird soaring through the skies, the second was like a bird diving with its wings pinned back, and the last was a majestic bird fluttering its wings, vanishing and then reappearing from sight. This is the one. Like this, Lionel chose his second quasi-bronze treasure. Say, Uncle Montez. Lionel's gaze became absent-minded for a moment as he held onto Gold Feather Step. He felt as though his mind had been taken into an all-new world. Do you think it's possible to reach the 4 Seasons realm in movement? Montez's aura abruptly changed, his gaze becoming sharp as though he wanted to look into Lionel's soul. However, after a while, he saw that Lionel was still in a daze as though he wasn't thinking about what he was saying at all. What a little monster. I wonder if he can do it. If others heard Montez's thoughts, they would think if he was wondering about whether Lionel could succeed in the task he just asked about. Only Uncle Montez himself knew that he was referring to something much grander. Whatever that something grander was, it was related to the question Lionel had just asked. A long while later, Lionel finally shook awake and carefully placed Gold Feather Step away. For my last quasi-bronze treasure, I need a better force art quill. I'm beginning to get a bit limited by my current one. Oh. Montez chuckled and clapped his hands once again. For Lionel to make such a choice, it was clear that his force crafting was coming along quite well. Eventually, Lionel picked out a black quill with sharp silver trimmings. Lionel's last quill came with a wind force art that aided in swiftness, but Lionel found it to be a bit gimmicky. This one came with a metallic affinity that added sharpness. Like this, Lionel could use less force to inscribe on tougher metals. This would help with his accuracy and precision in the long run, not to mention his stamina. With this quill, Lionel might very well be able to pump out Tier 9 black treasures of his own with consistency from now on. At this point, Lionel had 4 more treasures to pick. Since one was left for his ticket to terrain, he had just 3. Lionel realized that with his skill in force crafting, using these rewards on treasures would be a waste. What he needed were things he couldn't build or make himself now or in the immediate future. After some thought, he decided to ask a question. Uncle Montez, I have a beast partner with a dark elemental affinity. But right now the little guy is just an infant and is probably at the best time to help set his future path. He also has a lot of talent, his ability is already within the bronze grade despite still being a third-dimensional creature. Do you have anything that can help him mature along the right path? Montez blinked. It seemed like this kid was set on giving him more and more surprises every time they met. A third-dimensional creature with a fifth-dimensional ability most definitely had an exaggerated growth path ahead of it. If treated properly, this little beast could be a lifelong partner. In addition, since the little mink was born on Earth, it had a chance to. Montez smiled and clapped his hands once more. Chapter 332. Abilities were an incredibly important part of a person's potential. Even among those of the highest echelon, entities that existed within the 6th of 7th dimension, often, their most powerful tool were their abilities. Abilities could transcend strength. An existence like the little mink who had a 5th-dimensional ability could display combat prowess far beyond the realms of reason. In addition, the little guy also avoided the suppression one would experience upon entering higher dimensional worlds. However, at the same time, subduing such a partner was incredibly difficult. The fact Lionel had would of course surprise Montez because the latter knew that Lionel didn't have a beast-taming ability. Bring the little one out. Lionel nodded and brought little Blackstar out. The little guy was still in the midst of his dreamland. Rolling over in Lionel's hands, the little mink stuck his little tongue out in a yawn before burying its little head in Lionel's chest. Montez's gaze landed on little Blackstar, observing intently for a while. The little one is indeed an infant. I'd say at most a few months old, maybe only half a year at most. Within a zone, aging continued as per one's original timeline. But even if this wasn't the case, the little mink had spent most of the time within suspended animation, which stopped all biological functions to begin with except for certain exceptions like healing in some cases. Of course, that was only if Lionel allowed it. The fact the little mink was so young made something else make much more sense. The Project Hunt Island should have been properly vetted to maintain a certain level of difficulty. But Lionel was certain that there was no way anyone other than himself could have dealt with this little mink. The fact the little mink was only born recently somewhat took the Slayer Legion off the hook for such a mistake, albeit just a small bit. So it's a Shadow Sovereign, huh? Montez mumbled beneath his breath. Shadow Sovereign? Lionel asked. Shadow magic is an uncommon branch to run across, though it exists. Those who learn it through unconventional means can be considered minor disciples of the practice. Those who inherit it through their lineage factor are a step above in this regard and can be considered primary disciples. But those who awaken it through their abilities are considered to be of the highest regard and can become shadow sovereigns. Of course, that depends on the evolution potential of said ability. There are often times when a lineage factor can surpass an ability. Lionel's eyes lit up with understanding. It seems that he had underestimated just how important abilities were even now. From Uncle Montez's words, it seemed that abilities even superseded lineage factors. Though this wasn't always the case, it seemed to be enough of a precedent to allow Uncle Montez to say those words with confidence. If you want to lay a path for the little one, the best choice is to allow its ability to resonate and synergize with a lineage factor. So, at that moment, the shifting of the counter had come to a stop and several vials of blood appeared. Each of these vials of blood will develop the little one down a different path. However, along with these vials, you also need to trade for the method of implementing them. All in all, any choice you make will be worth 2 Tier 9 black treasures. Lionel nodded in understanding. He didn't know anything about using blood to enhance one's ability, but from what he understood about the human body, just drinking it obviously wouldn't help integrate the blood properly. Of course, Lionel had no idea that the woman he was always thinking of had done exactly that. But Aina was a bit of a special case. Shadow magic has many potential branches and a wide-ranging scope. Montez pointed to the first of 5 vials. This comes from an infant dark mimicry bat. Upon maturation it becomes a 5th-dimensional beast. In fact, this is the same for all the others as well. Its blood helps enhance the mimicry branch of shadow lineage factors. Everyone's shadow is as unique as one's soul. The mimicry branch can analyze that uniqueness, snatch it, and make it its own. Lionel's eyes suddenly widened. So that's what that was. Gem? Montez sent a questioning look toward Lionel. Lionel recollected himself. Little Blackstar has a shadow world within his body. Due to a skill I gained within the mythological zone called Perfect Union, I can see into it a small bit. But maybe because the skill is pretty low level, I can only get a vague understanding of it. But I once saw a life that I was sure wasn't Little Blackstar's within it. I was racking my brain thinking about what it was. But now I feel like it must have been a form of mimicry that Blackstar hasn't quite learned to use yet. Though Perfect Union sounded, well, perfect, it had ultimately been just a silver skill from Merlin's trials. How could it be as flawless as described? The life that Lionel saw within Blackstar's shadow world had baffled Lionel for a long time. But, within the trials, he had chosen to ignore it and focus on what he did understand. After all, he was fighting for his life, he didn't have the luxury to slowly figure things out. And now that Lionel thought about it, that life form reminded him a lot of. Lionel's eyes glowed. Within the Force Core mine, Little Blackstar had fought Simeon's numbered warriors and killed one of them with a sharp force ability. Lionel hadn't been able to pinpoint what was so familiar about that life until Montez spoke just now. That much meant that Little Blackstar could elicit the ability of that man. But how much he could glean or use and to what level of strength was still questionable. It was just the first vial of blood, but Lionel was already greatly intrigued. Chapter 333. Oh? The more Montez learned about this little mink, the more curious he became. From what he knew, Shadow World was an extremely exclusive and legendary ability of shadow magic users. The fact this little mink had it meant that it wasn't limited in the shadow abilities it could use, whether it was the magic system's offensive, defensive, evasive, or auxiliary abilities, he could learn them all. A good chance that this little one could indeed. Montez mumbled. A good chance? For what? Montez smiled mysteriously. Every world has its own champions. The champion of the humans is the wielder of the world spirit. But, when it comes to newly evolved worlds like yours, beasts are at a great disadvantage. Did you think that the universe just favored humanoid creatures? Of course beasts have their own opportunities. Whether or not you can find out more will depend on yourself and this little one. Lionel's gaze sparkled but didn't ask any more. This vial is from the dark illusion mouse. It's a creature especially known for its speed and evasive maneuvers. It has the ability to disappear in the shadows and become incorporeal. This falls within the movement branch of shadow magic. This vial is from the purple red-eyed spider. It's known for its corrosive energy. This falls within the attack branch of shadow magic and specifically within the corrosive force sub-branch. This vial is from the prowling. Lionel listened to Montez seriously. Of the vials, one focused on the mimicry branch, one of the movement branch, two of the offensive branch, and the final was a special case that could fit in the attack and defensive branch. Lionel had thought he would settle on the mimicry branch the moment he heard about it. This was because the little mink seemed to have already awakened a likability. Plus, the little guy's attack wasn't lacking. But after he heard about the final beast, the undying abyss bear, he hesitated. The bear had a special evolution of dark elemental force that carried some characteristics of a black hole. It allowed attacks to be easily nullified, giving it great defenses. But it likewise had a devastating attack as a result. It was a hard decision, but Lionel ultimately decided upon the mimicry branch. His reasoning was simple. Choosing the undying abyss bear blood would be like cornering the little mink's future progress, while the mimicry branch was the exact opposite. If Lionel made the foundation of the little mink's ability mimicry, it would lay a foundation that could deviate with endless possibilities. However, if he chose the blood of the undying abyss bear, it would lock in the little mink's dark elemental force to a certain type unless the blood was purged. As long as a proper foundation was laid, anything could be chosen in the future. It wouldn't be too late to give the little mink the black hole characteristic by then. But for now, Lionel felt it was smarter to both lay a broader foundation while also following up on the evolution path the little mink was already tending toward to begin with. "He'll choose the dark mimicry bat," Lionel said after a long while. Montez nodded, exchanging the blood and method of use with Lionel at once. This left Lionel with just one treasure to pick from. Remember that you're raising this little one as your own. Since you've picked his path, you have to be careful about what you choose for its next evolution. Also, remember that this blood is only supplementary. Your choices are meant to enhance the ability of your partner, not supersede them. If a human were to take this blood, the effects would be minimal at best, not to mention leave behind lingering injuries. Beasts are somewhat better at consuming blood with the appropriate care and techniques, but the prerequisite is that the blood suits them. I'm satisfied with your first choice, so don't stray in the future. Hearing these words, Lionel nodded seriously. This dispelled all thoughts he had of potentially using this blood on himself and also left him at a loss for what to use his final treasure on. Lionel fell into his thoughts once again. At first, Lionel didn't know what he wanted. But after a while he remembered a certain chariot that once made him grind his teeth in rage. Back then he had suffered a big loss at the hands of Captain Sela. He swore that when he got the chance he would definitely get a movement treasure of better quality. Thinking of the Slayer Legion, Lionel's gaze flashed with a cold light. After a while, Lionel's cold demeanor faded into a grin. "Uncle Montez, I need a ride." At that moment, a familiar island was surrounded by a depressing gloom. This island was none other than the very one the Slayer Legion had found the Camelot Zone on. However, compared to the past it looked much different. Raging winds and violent storms had taken hold of the island. The thick trees swayed wildly from side to side, their green leaves flying in every which direction. The ground was soaked completely through, turning the endless greenery into a marshland that was more reminiscent of a rice farm than a forest. Up above, black clouds rolled and rumbled, flashing with vicious arcs of lightning. The shores of the island were a complete mess. The ocean looked like a dense expanse of black, huge waves crashing and rolling onto the sides of the island as though threatening to swallow it whole. It was on this very island and in these very conditions that a fiery argument was taking place. "Do you think that I, Hacker Hutch, am a pushover?" Hutch stood with a rusted blade, his seemingly old and frail frame standing tall beneath the rushing winds and heavy rain. Under the dark skies, he seemed like a sheathed blade ready to unleash at any moment. "Hutch, I suggest you put the blade away." A man whose momentum seemed no less than Hutch stood opposing him. Monet and Violet Rain had already exited, but judging by the fact no others had come with them, it was clear that everyone else had died. However, according to these women, Lionel was just fine. Hutch had stormed to this place the moment he heard about the actions Monet took behind his back that day. But by then they had already long since entered the zone, so he could only wait. Unfortunately, his movements had alerted others. And this matter only blew up further after it was found out that several promising geniuses and commanders had died within the zone, one of which actually personally died at Lionel's hand. On the sidelines, Badger stood with reddened eyes, the rain soaking him all the way through. When he heard that Mayfly had died, it hit him like a ton of bricks. Any hatred he held for not being allowed to enter the zone had been transferred toward his hatred for Lionel. He wanted nothing more than to rip him limb from limb. "Oh? And are you going to take my blade from me, Catrus? Come and take it." Catrus' face darkened. His standing was no less than Hutch's, a retired supreme. So why would he fear him? "I think it's best you think about your next steps carefully." Catrus practically growled, his figure seemingly growing by a size beneath his billowing aura. "Others are already dissatisfied with you. Do you think you can just boot an appointed supreme from their position just because you feel like it? Did you already forget what happened all those years ago?" Hutch's aura sharpened and he sneered a toothy grin. "It seems that my machete hasn't tasted blood in so long that some people really think they can talk to me however it is they want. I'll let you choose. Would you rather lose your left or right arm? Or would you prefer to lose a leg?" Hutch's bloodthirsty aura caused those spectating members of the Slayer Legion who had been tasked with protecting the island to feel as though their blood had frozen over. It was then that the whirring of the zone suddenly caught everyone's attention. At that moment, a teenage boy dressed in rags stepped out, his bronze hair becoming practically the only light in this dark atmosphere. The boy yawned. He seemed to genuinely be tired and couldn't be bothered by what was happening around him. When he wiped the tears from his eyes enough to clear his vision, he saw that he had been surrounded. "Oh, hey old man." The boy smiled. Who else could it be if not Lionel Morales? Chapter 334. Lionel's casual greeting reached all of their ears. At that moment, everyone's attention shot toward the same teenage boy. Despite the fact he looked as though he had just crawled out from a garbage dump, he held a certain undeniable valiant air that made him too difficult to ignore. Lionel yawned again. This sort of scene, why did it feel so familiar? Beneath their gazes, Lionel flipped his palm and allowed numerous snow globes to appear. Afterward, members of the Aderna family began to appear one after another, plopping to the ground as Lionel released them. Big brother Lionel. Nana was the first to recover as she wasn't harmed to begin with. While the others were still in a daze, Nana seemed to realize that Lionel must have been the one that saved them. Lionel smiled lightly, patting the little girl's head. Seeing her childish excitement, he could tell just how much the Camelot zone had weighed on her mind. The second of the Aderna family to come to was their oldest and the man that had been responsible for their lives. However, it seemed that he had failed in his task as a guardian fairly badly. And, to make matters worse, his mind was still foggy. He found it difficult to tell whether or not they were still within his zone. This elder's name was Mattias. He couldn't help but look toward Lionel with a hint of confusion. Lionel only smiled. "I hope your Aderna family remembers this favor." Mattias blinked in confusion. "Favor? Wait." He looked around and seemed to recognize the island they were on. They had escaped? Oh. Mattias had been absolutely certain that they would all be dead. "All right, bye." Lionel waved and seemed set to leave, causing many to be shocked. Catrus' gaze sharpened. Did this boy really not take them seriously? "Lionel." The roar cut through the heavy rain and rumbling clouds. Even Lionel couldn't help but look back only to see an infuriated Badger. In fact, the latter's skin had reddened to the point that it seemed to steam beneath the rain. Lionel frowned slightly. It wasn't only him but Hutch as well. It had to be remembered that Mayfly and Badger were sent by Hutch in order to save Lionel and the others of the island. It could be said that Badger was thus a person of Hutch's. No matter how you looked at it, him standing out now would only muddy the situation. "Do you have something to say to me?" Lionel shifted his gaze toward Badger. How could he not tell why the latter was enraged? However, what did Mayfly's death have to do with him? If he should be blaming anyone, it should be Monet for failing to protect her own. And even if he didn't want to blame Monet, he should then blame the Aderna family for screwing everything up to begin with. This was a unique zone. Deaths were practically inevitable. If the plan doesn't had entered, it was likely that the death count would have been the same if not worse. Badger fumed beneath Lionel's nonchalance, but he soon calmed, his gaze becoming a smothering volcano that was ready to erupt at any time. Large wings spread from his back. It seemed like he might shoot forward at any moment, ready to risk his life to take Lionel's. Lionel shook his head and couldn't be bothered. He didn't want to stir up any more problems. Before he left Earth, he still wanted to destroy the Royal Blue Fort. If these issues blew up instead, he would have to head to Terrain first and deal with it later. This was obviously something he didn't want to do. Lionel was still worried about his teammates. There was no telling if the junior Governor Duke had chosen to target his friends in his absence. In normal times, Lionel would trust James to protect them, but the event of that month taught him that James truly couldn't be counted upon. When it came down to it, James placed the matters of his family above friendship and camaraderie. If Lionel thought about it, there wasn't anything necessarily wrong with this approach. If he was asked to choose between his father and his friends, wouldn't the choice be obvious? Of course, if others heard Lionel's thoughts, they would think him too cold or calculating. How could one so easily make such a choice? But to Lionel it was just this simple. However, it seemed that Lionel wouldn't be getting his wish: unauthorized entry into a zone, hoarding of contraband, and the murder of a fellow soldier. Lionel's crimes were calmly listed by a familiar feminine voice. He didn't even need to look to know that the person in question was Monet. Lionel's gaze swept through the crowd to land on the red-armored middle-aged beauty. At this point, Lionel didn't even bother. He took out a talisman. Since he wasn't going to be able to leave here peacefully to do what he needed to do, he would just leave to Terrain now. However, he would remember this. He was certain that by the time he came back, these Supremes wouldn't be able to handle him even if they banded together as one. By then, no one could stop him from doing what he needed to do. The expression of those watching changed. Of all the things they expected, for Lionel to say not a word and truly prepare to leave caught them completely off guard. Lionel, wait. Huh? Lionel paused. There was only one person he would even bother to listen to at this point, and that was obviously Hutch. Though Lionel was a bit unsatisfied with the way the old man had kidnapped him against his will, delaying his plans to raze the Royal Blue Fort to the ground, he still felt that the retired Supreme was a net positive on his life. The old man sighed. Just stay, will you? With me here, who would dare do anything to you? If you want, in a few years, he'll even give my supreme position to you. He'll see who dares to say anything. Hearing these words, others were stunned while Lionel just smiled. I appreciate the sentiment, old man. But I think it's best that the Slayer Legion and I part ways from here on. Hutch shook his head. They're a bit shameless, but it's still not good to be alone in this new world order. Use like you need an umbrella to grow beneath. Lionel grinned. Shameless is a good word for it. The people I just saved the lives of are now accusing me of crimes. I wonder how many of them would be alive without me? Monet's expression turned ice cold, red flames flickering within the depths of her pupils. But Lionel continued unperturbed. And I dunno. Something about that umbrella term makes me itch all over. With a last smile, Lionel activated the talisman. They'll be seeing you, old man. Chapter 335. Everyone watched as Lionel vanished. In truth, it wasn't that they didn't consider the idea of Lionel using one of his rewards for a chance to escape, it was just that none of them had expected him to leave without practically saying a word. Had it not been for Hutch trying to get him to stay, he would have probably spared them all just a single glance and left. It was pure disdain. He couldn't even bother to try and defend himself regardless of whether or not he was in the right. He felt no obligation toward them. Yet somehow his gaze was burned into all their minds. He never said the words "I'll remember this" aloud, yet they somehow felt as though it was echoing in their ears again and again. Hutch sighed and shook his head. Seems that Brad is finally slowly awakening to his true self. Lionel's final words constantly reverberated in his mind. Something about that umbrella makes me itch all over. Suddenly Hutch began to laugh. He looked no different from a madman in the midst of the rain. But no one dared to take a madman holding a machete lightly. Catrice's expression flickered numerous times before it settled into a sneer. He'll be sure to report all of this back without missing a single detail, Hutch. Not only did you bring such a scourge into the Slayer Legion, you didn't even care that one of the geniuses under your charge died due to his actions. At that moment, Hutch seemed to remember something. Suddenly, his vision sharpened. Catrice's hair stood on end. He immediately shot backward, his nerves tense. In that instant the world seemed to slow. No matter how hard Catrice tried to move, he couldn't seem to accelerate. It was as though he had been slowed to slow motion or that the world around him had suddenly been fast-forwarded. Blood spurted as a limb twirled into the air. The crimson was quickly washed away by the endless barrage of rain, but even then, it was just as quickly replaced by a new flow. Catrus paled, looking down at his right arm which now lay on the ground. "Since you didn't make the choice, I decided to make the choice for you," Hutch said casually. His indifferent voice made everyone freeze. His complete nonchalance in the face of blood and gore made them feel as though he wouldn't lose a wink of sleep even if he killed them all one by one. "Consider this a simple reminder that you can't just speak to anyone as you please," Hutch continued. "And as for the death of Mayfly, you seem to forget that I raised her practically as my own daughter." The indifference in Hutch's voice soon became coldness. His gaze swept over, landing on Monet. In that instant, Monet felt as though she had been thrown into an icy hell. Her knees uncontrollably buckled, causing her to almost fall to the ground. All the lofty demeanor she had even when she was facing the demons of Camelot came crumbling down with a single look. I would really like to know what her superior officer was doing as Mayfly died. You all seem to want to focus on the fact that Lionel wasn't meant to enter, when the truth was that Lionel was originally on the list of entries. The one who wasn't was Monet, who self-inserted. Isn't that right? Monet shivered. This was true. Originally, Badger and Mayfly were meant to enter as one. They were so used to partnering with one another that the sum of their teamwork was far beyond themselves individually. To say that they could surpass a Supreme when working together wasn't an exaggeration at all. This was the New World Order after all. Being older didn't necessarily mean you were stronger, since Earth was still in its infancy. Monet grit her teeth and squeezed out all her strength to speak. Lionel injured Badger before their entry. There was no choice. Oh. Hutch laughed as though he was amused that Monet dared to speak back. And why would he hurt Badger? Hadn't they just worked together to escape the beast tide on the Project Hunt Island? I wonder what made them enemies in such a short time? Hutch's question seemed light, but they all put more and more pressure on Monet. The latter felt as though her heart might stop completely if she was pressured any more. At that moment, the situation suddenly changed. Hutch's gaze narrowed as he looked off into the distance. An older man with a head of white, flowing hair approached with a pair of massive white wings. He looked no different from a deity descending upon the mortal world. Whether it was his demeanor or looks, he seemed impeccable. Even the winds and rain bent around him. "That's enough, Hutch." Hutch looked up but didn't say much of anything. He only sheathed his blade and began to walk away with broad steps. The angelic man frowned toward the disregard. "I hope you understand, Hutch, that among the retired Supreme, you aren't the only one who's awakened a variant ability. If you make an enemy of us all..." At that moment, the angelic man found the world around him slowing. His eyes widened, a blinding golden light emitting from his body. But before he could react, Hutch had already appeared in the skies, snatching a handful of white feathers and landing heavily on the ground. "I wonder how many more do you think I need to pluck off before you can't fly above me anymore?" The angelic man suddenly seethed in rage. But, remembering Hutch's ability, he also felt his heart go cold. Why did such a madman have to awaken such an ability? In the end, the angelic man remained silent, watching as Hutch walked away. Though Hutch seemed slow, he had already left the range of the island in the blink of an eye, gliding over the black, raging waters. At the moment Hutch was gaining some interest for Lionel, the latter had found himself in a completely unexpected situation. Unlike Aina, Lionel was teleported to a proper place. There was a well-elevated platform located in the middle of a bustling city. In fact, Lionel's initial appearance didn't garner much attention until it did. Lionel hadn't even stepped off the platform yet when a dozen armed guards charged forward, spears and swords in hand, as they completely surrounded him. Lionel turned his gaze back to the first person he had seen after entering this place. She was a woman of average looks who gained a salary for manning and maintaining the order of the teleportation pad. In fact, Lionel and her had just had an amicable exchange. The dictionary had begun to work again, so Lionel only had to rely on it to communicate in this odd new language. He didn't think there was a problem with doing so, as he had already noticed several translation treasures in the hands or on the bodies of others. But now, for whatever reason, that same woman who he had just been conversing with was avoiding his gaze. Lionel wanted nothing more than to find a hotel and take a nice long sleep. But now he was suddenly being threatened from all sides. Where was the justice? Chapter 336. Lionel was speechless. Just how bad was his luck? He hadn't even been on this world for all of 5 minutes when he suddenly found himself in a heap of trouble once again. The worst part was, he didn't even know what he had done wrong. At that moment, there were shouts coming at him from all directions, but he couldn't understand anything they were saying. Though it was possible to use the dictionary to translate, that could obviously only be done one at a time. He had no idea what all the fuss was about. Lionel closed his eyes and shook his head, willing his fatigue away to deal with the current situation. Speak one at a time please, I have no idea what you're saying. Lionel used the dictionary to translate these words, but the shouting didn't seem to stop. In fact, it intensified. It was obvious that these people knew Lionel was a foreigner and this wasn't even an area where foreigners were rare, yet they kept speaking in their native tongue. It was hard to believe that they weren't doing it all on purpose. Lionel tried to speak with the lady that received him again, but she continued to avoid eye contact for reasons he was left completely in the dark of. He truly had no idea why he was being treated like this. By this point, a sizable crowd had been built. After all, this was a bustling city square to begin with and was most definitely a hotspot for tourists. When they saw such good entertainment before them, how could they not take a pause for a look? As more and more people gathered, Lionel suddenly noticed a striking difference between himself and them. Everywhere he looked, no matter where it was, everyone was excellently dressed. Even the most modest amongst these people who kept their jewelry to a minimum and refrained from wearing elaborate dresses carved of expensive furs exuded the air of nobility. Lionel had always been an observant person. It wasn't a matter of his ability, but rather his social abilities. He realized that in a place like this, considering he was dressed from head to toe in rags, he stuck out like a sore thumb. Is it really because of my clothing? At this point, the shouting around Lionel seemed to come to a stop, which caused Lionel to stop observing his surroundings. A leader of sorts stepped forward and spoke some words. Lionel sighed a breath of relief. Finally, we're getting somewhere. Lionel could tell that they had stopped their shouting tactic after realizing he wasn't very moved by it at all. He didn't know why these armored warriors wanted to intimidate him, but he could only slowly realize the truth from here on out. State your name, affiliation, and purpose. The dictionary translated for Lionel, finally allowing him to tell just what was going on. I need to learn this language as quickly as possible. Lionel didn't feel off-put by the question. Even on Earth alone, just traveling from province to province elicited questions just like this. It only made sense that it would be asked when it came to travel between worlds. My name is Lionel, I come from Earth. I'm only here on vacation. Lionel felt there was no need to speak about his purpose of finding Aina. Speaking truthfully would only raise more questions. In addition, he had no idea what Aina's current situation was, but he still hadn't forgotten that eerie feeling from before. If he wasn't just being paranoid and she really was in trouble, then mentioning the fact that he was looking for her would only put them both in danger. The spectators had much more sophisticated translation treasures than Lionel did. So, they all understood his words practically immediately. But as a result, they were confused and gave Lionel weird looks. They had never heard of it. Though Earth was greatly valued by higher dimensional worlds, information about it wasn't quite widespread yet. These people might look rich, but compared to true nobles they still had a long way to go. That said, the reason they were giving Lionel weird gazes wasn't because of this. There were too many worlds, how could they know all of them? That was impossible. What they found weird was the fact he said he was here to be a tourist, but if that was the case, why was he dressed like that? Lionel, however, was thinking about something completely different. He didn't miss the sharpening of the captain's gaze after he spoke of Earth. Just what was going on? Come with us for further questioning, the captain said coldly. Lionel frowned at these words, but the guards seemed to react immediately to his hesitation, placing their hands on their weapons. There's something weird about these guards. They don't seem to be dressed like natives of this land. Lionel separated out everyone he observed into 3 categories. There were natives, tourists, and these guards. Natives all seemed to wear garbs that crossed flexible armor with robes, giving them a distinctive look. These guards, however, had their own mode of dressing. Each of them wore fluttering robes, but they were split below their waist into 4 sections. 1 section to each of the sides of their hips and 1 to their front and back. This design exposed the metallic sheet armor that covered their legs. In addition to this, each of them had the same design on their lapels, a golden pin that held an oddly shaped star and cross. It seemed to exude a level of authority that garnered the respect of all those that looked at them. The more Lionel observed, the more he felt there was something off about this. He looked back toward the woman who had received him again, not surprised to find her still dodging his gaze. By now, he was certain that these men were called here by her. What a joke. To think they had just been having a friendly conversation only to find out that she had been stirring up trouble for him. The young woman shivered. Compared to Lionel's previous inquisitive gaze, she could feel the coldness of this one. Her heart skipped several beats, losing its regularity. The change left her unable to breathe properly. Lionel looked away. "I will follow you." He regained his calm, glancing toward the captain with an indifferent expression. The captain frowned, but ultimately gave the signal to surround Lionel and escort him away. Chapter 337. The young woman watched Lionel's back disappear into the distance, her breathing still hitching. It was only after a long while that she gritted her teeth in rage. If it wasn't for the fact she was still in public, she would have likely found anything she could to throw and bash around. How dare he? How dare he? How dare he? The young lady ground her teeth in silence. "Ree? What happened? Who was that guy?" At that moment, a familiar voice to the young lady stepped forward. The young woman, Ree, looked up to find exactly who she expected to. It was another young woman of similar age and type. They both had decent looks and cute features. It was truly a case of like people attracting one another. From afar they even looked quite like sisters even though they weren't. "Sil? I thought you said that this job would be easy?" Sil giggled, rounding Rye's desk and hooking her arm around her friend's. "You've already had this job for years. Now that you've soaked up all the benefits, you want to come back here and blame me?" It seemed that Sil had quite the standing. If not, how could she have possibly helped regain such a position? Sil seemed quite amused by her friend's complaining and wanted to ask more, but the teleportation pad suddenly lit once again. Ree hid her dissatisfaction and politely greeted another client. After some pleasantries, she sent this person on their way and sat back down in a huff. "Now can you tell me what happened?" Ree pouted. "With your connections you could easily find out. Why make me talk about something that makes me upset? What kind of friend are you?" Sil giggled. "Second and third-hand information isn't as good as the real thing. Come on, don't hold out on me. Plus, you know that my family doesn't have much jurisdiction over them." When she said these words, Sil's playful expression became a tad bit more solemn. But regardless, she still pressed Ree for answers. Ree sighed and caved in. "A couple months ago, they briefed all of us attendants on some new information. Apparently they're cracking down on fugitives and escapees. Whenever I see a sign of suspicious activity, I'm supposed to make small talk with the suspect and secretly call for reinforcements. But this bastard actually glared at me like that just because I was doing my job." Sil's eyes sparkled. "A crackdown? What? Who are they trying to catch? Who would be bold enough to become a fugitive in the eyes of those people?" Clearly to Sil this wasn't a normal case. Let's just say that becoming a fugitive of a world or even a network of worlds wasn't as bad as becoming a fugitive in the eyes of these people. "I don't know anything, I just followed their orders," Ree said with an exasperated sigh. Sil giggled. "He only glared at you a bit, is there a need to be so angry?" Ree gave her own glare at these words. "You don't get it. I thought I was going to die. A measly third-dimensional brat actually pressured me, how embarrassing." Sil blinked. "He was in the third dimension yet you still called them for him?" Ree froze for a moment. Then she blushed profusely. It seemed she realized she had done something wrong. That was right, how could someone in the third dimension be who they were looking for? It was no wonder he glared at her. After a while, Ree regained her bearing and bit her teeth. Even if she made a mistake, there was no need to treat her like that. What a bad guy. What good was being a bit handsome if you were so weak? Humph. Ree finally snorted. "If I see him again, he'll definitely have sister-in-law teach him a lesson." Sil burst into a fit of giggles. This sister-in-law Ree was referring to was actually her own sister-in-law. Sil had an elder brother who treated the both of them like his own little sisters. So, despite the fact they weren't blood-related, Ree still called her sister-in-law. Of course, there were deeper matters in relation to this oddity, but they were unimportant at this moment. "It's really curious though," Sil said after a moment. "Isn't it supposed to be a struggle for those in the third dimension to adjust to a fourth-dimensional world? Where did he get the strength to glare at you?" Ree froze again, seemingly stumped once more. Sil giggled and shook her head. This friend of hers had always been a bit simple. If not for this, she would have helped her get a far more prestigious job than this. Though this gig paid well and was very stable and safe, it wasn't exactly the most esteemed. Young Mississippi, just when Sil wanted to speak with Rhea a bit more, a strict voice sounded from her back. To her back, there was an inconspicuous man with sparse hair. He was well dressed and groomed, while his hands were perpetually clasped behind his back. However, the way his hair fluttered about like the wings of a bird made it difficult for Sil to take him very seriously. That said, this was only because she knew that this old man would never harm her. For others, if they saw this old man, they would head in the opposite direction 99% of the time. The remaining percentage point was an unknown variable. After all, the dead couldn't testify. Already? Sil pouted. Yes, this is very important, young Mississippi. The city lord isn't willing to compromise on this. Sil sighed and shook her head. She knew that talking wouldn't do her any good. Fine. Let's go. I'll see you later, Rhea. Okay. Rhea waved her friend goodbye. At that moment, Lionel sat in a blank room. This was the best way he could describe it. The walls were a dull gray. The singular chair he sat on was a dull gray. The singular table before him was a dull gray. It was even difficult to see the outline of the door to this place. It was as though Lionel had been tossed into a cube with no exit. After a few minutes turned to almost an hour, Lionel felt a keen sense of déjà vu. He had a flashback to the time Pope Margrave wasted his time. But this time he didn't have the option to leave at all. Lionel yawned. Since they wanted to make him wait, that was fine. Lionel took out a pillow and a blanket, climbed onto the table and fell into a deep sleep. Soon, the sound of light snoring filled the small room. Chapter 338. Lionel fell into a deep sleep almost immediately. Of course, he was using the meditation rest technique his father had taught him. But, to the outside world, he was out cold without any understanding of what was happening around him. When Lionel entered this place, he realized many things. For one, these people didn't take him very seriously. They didn't restrain him, nor did they take his things away. It was very likely they believed he was weak. Lionel didn't mind allowing this illusion to continue. But at the same time, he knew that it very well may not be an illusion at all. Lionel had never seen a fourth-dimensional entity battle. However, according to the information he had, no matter how powerful one was within a lower dimension, it was impossible to challenge a higher one with very few exceptions. Lionel didn't know how true this was or if the crystallization of his force could help bridge this gap, but he didn't feel like finding out by putting his life on the line. All Lionel knew was that if he didn't rest his mind, he would be at an even greater disadvantage. So, that was exactly what he did. Without a care for anything going on around him, he entered a deep dreamland. By some stroke of coincidence, or maybe due to the fact Lionel was right about them not taking him seriously, no one was monitoring Lionel. They likely believed that they could sweat Lionel out just like any other prisoner. If they let him sit alone for a long while, he'd probably spill out everything he knew when he finally saw another person. Unfortunately, due to their lack of bothering to monitor him, none of them realized that the young man they thought they were pressuring was taking a nice nap. Across the universe, it could be said that there were countless centers of power. But, more often than not, these powers would have the shadow of stronger entities to their backs, and those stronger entities would have even stronger backers. This was simply the way of the world. On Earth, which county didn't have a city backing it? Which city wasn't backed by a state or province? Which state or province didn't have a country behind it? This was simply how things functioned. In this new world order where having and not having resources was the difference between life and death, powers who could stand to support others had their hands in as many pots as possible. When things are put into this perspective, it truly isn't a surprise that Earth was targeted in such a way. Even under the protection and overwatch of so many powerful existences, there were some with enough backing that still dared to make a move. In such a complicated environment, it was too difficult to hold such powers accountable for their actions. So they acted with impunity. And if they failed, so what? Who would call them out for it? Of course, there were some that tried to call out the wrongs of these powers. But how long did these foolish individuals survive for? Once again, it seemed as though someone didn't know their place. Aelyard has died. The room wasn't dark and sinister as one might expect. In fact, it was well lit and lavishly furnished. And as though to prove that these entities truly had nothing to hide or didn't deem it necessary to hide anything, this meeting took place within the private room of a bustling high-class restaurant. That's unfortunate. I assume everything was handled appropriately? Silence fell over the room. This lack of response seemed to catch everyone's attention. Their careless demeanors paused for a moment in place of several sneers. So it seems someone else doesn't know their place? Just deal with them as usual. Everyone around the table seemed to agree with this. It seemed that there was no need for further discussion. Leave it to the head of that quadrant. Agreed. The conversation started and ended just as quickly. To these men and women, what was a small fry from a pseudo-fourth-dimensional world even worth? The fact they wasted a few seconds of their day on such an ant was already too much respect in their eyes. The decision of these entities quickly moved down the ranks, jumping through several chains of command before finally making it the ears it needed to make it to. The man was tall and lanky, carrying a pale complexion that made it seem as though he was either a foot into the grave or one step out of it. Commander Scythe. An attendant respectfully knelt before the man, yet he didn't even turn back. He stood looking out a wide, curved window. Stars and asteroids shot across his vision as planets and moons shone beautifully in the distance. It was the kind of scene only a handful of people from Earth had seen personally. Yet, in this new world order, anyone with a little bit power could lay eyes on such a scene. Despite the lack of an answer, the attendant didn't dare to make another sound, continuing to kneel in silence. Eventually he spoke. Leave the information here. You can go. The voice sounded just as dead as the man's sunken expression. Who knew if it was because it had been too long since his last meal or if this man was really dead, but his skin was pressed so flush against his cheeks that it seemed the bone might tear through it at any moment. Scythe picked up the files as the door to his office was closed. When he finished reading them, a flicker of disdain couldn't help but flash within his eyes. Lionel Morales? They wanted him to personally take care of a brat? Was this supposed to be a joke? Scythe shook his head and pressed a button. Find out for me where this Lionel Morales is. It's too painful to descend to the pseudo-fourth dimension. I expect no mistakes or else he'll have your head. Yes, sir. A voice came from the other side. Scythe walked back to enjoying his view, the clanking of his armor being audible with his every step. If Lionel had been there, he would have noticed an eerily familiar uniform. Robes that split into 4 pieces at the waist. Legs covered in sheet armor beneath them. A pin that looked like the cross between a star and cross on the lapel. Chapter 339. The sudden opening of a door shook Lionel out of his sleeping state. He yawned and stretched, sitting up from the table. He had to say that sleeping on a table wouldn't have been the most comfortable experience for him in the past. But after practicing to the standard stage, it might as well have been a soft bed to the current him. Lionel wiped the tears and sleep from his eyes, finally locking eyes with those that walked into the room. There were 2 individuals, 1 man and 1 woman. They both wore the same split robes and metallic leg sleeves. These uniforms are quite cool. Lionel thought playfully to himself. I wonder how I can join? Of course, Lionel was just having a joke at the expense of himself. With his luck in joining organizations, he'd probably be being hunted to his death within another few days. Still, that didn't change the fact he felt these outfits were quite stylish. Sometimes even Lionel himself forgot he was a teenage boy. Coach had always said, look good, play good. The better one felt, the better they could perform. It seemed that this organization, whatever it was, seemed to take this quite seriously as well. While Lionel was observing the pair, the 2 of them were looking toward him with incredulous expressions. Wasn't this young man supposed to be sweating their appearance? Why the hell is it that he was sleeping? The young woman wrinkled her nose. It seemed that a negative effect of locking Lionel in here for so long was that his smell had been highly concentrated into this area. Lionel slid off the table and put his blanket and pillow away. Flakes of dried blood fell from his body and coated the table, but he didn't bother to clean it. He felt the cleanliness of the room had nothing to do with him, quite frankly. Though he had been cleansed twice by his 2-star constitution and could even stay fresh for longer than normal humans, given enough time, he would still end up in such a state. He was still very much mortal. Lionel sat down on the chair as though nothing had happened and smiled lightly. Might I ask what I've been brought in for now? Compared to the first time they saw him, Lionel's gaze was much sharper and focused. It seemed that he had really needed that nap. It seemed it might have been an issue to leave him here alone for so long. Hearing Lionel's question, the pair soon regained their level of professionalism, sitting across from Lionel as though they couldn't see the flakes of blood and dirt on the table or smell the horrid stench in the air. Lionel took out the dictionary and placed it on the table to help him translate. It's our job to monitor suspicious activity. The man replied with a deadpan expression. In addition, you match the description of several fugitives we've been looking for. Lionel smiled bitterly. It seemed that it really was his style of dress that got him thrust into this situation. Had he taken his time to clean up, maybe he wouldn't even be here. I apologize for giving that sort of impression. The reason I look like this is because I recently cleared a subdimensional zone on my home world and used one of my rewards in exchange for a ticket to terrain. In my excitement, I came here right after I left without thinking things through. I've never left my home world before. Lionel explained his side of the story politely. Of course, much of it was a lie, and in some ways he really could be considered a fugitive. At the very least, he had run away from his home planet for reasons. But they didn't need to know that. Plus, Lionel said with a bitter expression, "I'm just a third-dimensional existence from a new world. How could I be one of the fugitives you're looking for?" Though the pair before him didn't react much to his words, Lionel's senses were exceptionally keen. He could see that they had already believed as much before even stepping into this room. Lionel wasn't sure why they brought him in. It might have been to do their due diligence or for another reason he was unaware of. But he could tell that they didn't truly plan on punishing him. Sometimes people with power just enjoyed wasting the time of those beneath them. Lionel felt that this might just be one of those cases. Still, since he was weak and had no backing, this was simply one of those things he had to accept with a smile on his face even though he was furious inside. As expected, the pair didn't respond directly to Lionel's question. The female flipped her palm and took out a folder of documents. "You will be monitored by our people for the next 3 years. As long as you do nothing to violate the laws, you will be relieved of this mark on your record." Lionel's smile suddenly faded into a deep frown. They wanted the right to monitor him for 3 years despite the fact he hadn't done anything wrong? What kind of nonsense was this? Was this supposed to be some sort of joke? "You want to monitor me for 3 years despite the fact I haven't done anything wrong?" Lionel asked coldly. The man sneered. "If you haven't done anything wrong, what's the issue with being monitored?" Lionel nearly snapped at this sort of reasoning. If it wasn't for his better judgment, he might have just pulled out his spear right then and there. Maybe in the past, Lionel wouldn't care as much about this. After all, he truly had done nothing wrong, and thanks to his experience with the Empire, he was already used to his every action being monitored. However, it was precisely because of the Empire that he was becoming more and more sensitive to such things. And it only made things worse that he was being treated like this just due to ridiculous, unwarranted suspicion. Lionel's jaw clenched, his gaze turning a frosty shade of green. Without a word, he signed the documents before him. As though a contract had bound him, the documents glowed. Before Lionel could react, a light shot from within the documents and onto his forehead. A moment later, a thin black brand spread between his brows as though marking him. Lionel's fury was stoked several more levels. He had already read through the documents and knew that this would happen, but when he actually felt it, he couldn't help but feel the urge to do something he would regret. Seeing Lionel try to maintain control over his emotions, the woman remained expressionless while the man sneered. So what if he was angry? He was branded like a slave and couldn't even do a thing about it. Chapter 340? Lionel closed his eyes, the tumultuous flow of his blood slowing down to a crawl. Rage wouldn't get him anything, anger wouldn't get him anything. After a long while, Lionel slowly stood and walked toward the door. He didn't say anything toward the female-male pair. Nothing he said would have changed anything to begin with. Seeing Lionel's reaction, the young woman remained expressionless while the male's sneer deepened. Wasn't this sort of reaction obvious? Even if Lionel felt wronged, so what? He may have been worth something on his own world, but in this place he was nothing but an ant that could be squashed at the whims of others. Lionel stepped out from the room and left. Even without stepping foot outside the building, he could feel the glances he received as though each was boring into his very being. The mark that hovered above his forehead was too distinctive. Anyone could see it at a single glance. Lionel didn't even bother to try and cover it up. He knew that there would be no point. If a simple headband could circumvent such a thing, whatever organization this was truly wouldn't be worth very much to begin with. Eventually, Lionel pushed open the doors and stood at the top of a tall and wide set of stairs. For this organization to hold such a large property in such a bustling city, their standing was clear. Every square inch in a place like this likely cost an astronomical amount. As someone from Earth who was familiar with overpopulation problems, Lionel knew this more than others. Lionel looked up to the top of the building, seeing the very same star and cross symbol. To this point he still didn't know what the title of this organization was, nor had anyone ever mentioned it to him. It seemed to be one of those things that everyone knew of, but also didn't dare to speak of easily. Considering his style of dress, where he stood, and what hung above his forehead, Lionel stood out like a sore thumb. There was no limit of individuals who observed him from afar, whispering to one another. However, Lionel continued to stand there as though burning the image of that star and cross into his mind. Then he turned and walked away. "Impossible, we don't accept your kind here. Please leave. All of our rooms are booked, sir. Please accept our greatest Apollo." "Ah, yes, right away. The room has already been cleaned and prepped. This way, please." "Scram. I don't care if you're willing to pay double." Lionel expressionlessly strolled out of his final attempt. He felt nothing but numbness by this point. After a while he looked up toward the setting sun. It seemed as though the whole day had already gone by. In truth, he hadn't spent the whole day searching for accommodations. Most of the time had been wasted away in that organization's building. It was only the past half an hour that he had spent moving from location to location, hoping to find a place of residence. Though Lionel had the segmented cube, he knew that he couldn't so easily or casually use it. This was no longer Earth, there were plenty of people he had to fear here. As of now, he had only used the dictionary as a translator, so no one grew greedy about it. Who would care about such a primitive translation treasure? However, the segmented cube was a spatial treasure capable of housing life. If others came to know of it, Lionel would be hunted to the ends of terrain. Lionel saw a food stall in the distance and suddenly realized it had been a long time since he ate anything that he didn't roast himself. Though he had a practically infinite supply of meat thanks to the snow globes, it got bland eating nothing but unseasoned meat all the time. However, before Lionel could even approach, the middle-aged woman who ran the stand gave him a stare as though daring him to come and suffer the consequences. Lionel shook his head and sighed. There was no purpose in staying in this city anymore. Lionel felt several eyes on him as he walked toward the outside of the city. How am I supposed to find Aina like this? No one would give Lionel the time of day. Not only could he not find a place to stay, he couldn't find a place to eat. As he was now, it would be impossible to gather any information. How could he if no one would talk to him? They say that this mark is only supposed to be a sign of suspicion and not criminality, but who would want a suspicious person around them? It was practically guaranteed to stay this way. The city gates will be closing in half an hour and will not open again until dawn tomorrow. Though the guard could see the mark on Lionel's forehead, he still casually said these words. After all, it was his job to say at least this much. That said, he didn't even look directly at Lionel as he spoke. Lionel just shook his head and bitterly laughed. Stay in the city? For what? To sleep on the streets? What was the point of that? At least if he left the city he could take another rest in comfort so long as he found a deserted region. Also, clothing stores refused entry, so unless he repaired his chain necklace, he would have to make his own clothing. Either way, he would only be able to do this with his segmented cube, and he would only be safe to use his segmented cube if he left this place. Thanks, Lionel said non-committedly. The guard and his colleagues shook their heads and soon began to converse amongst themselves, not minding Lionel anymore. It was just when Lionel was almost out of earshot that he heard something that caught his interest by relying on the dictionary. Chapter 341. Another fugitive, Tisk. Technically no, that was just a mark of suspicion. They're only monitoring him. Poor guy probably just got caught up in something that was over his head. Whatever it is, he's pretty stupid to leave the city. He's just asking to die. He hasn't even stepped out of the third dimension yet, but he wanted to survive outside of the city walls? Who do you think he'll fall to, an invalid or a beast? Let's play some bets. The guards spoke as they pleased. To them, it was impossible for Lionel to hear them from so far away. And even if they knew he could hear them, it was highly unlikely that they'd even care enough to stop. Well, what's his alternative? He probably couldn't find a place to stay and he was probably stupid enough to come here with a one-way ticket. You think someone like him could even afford a ticket back to his own world? Lionel smiled bitterly. That was true, he had no way back to Earth for now. Though that wasn't because he couldn't afford it. Unlike Earth, terrain had teleportation paths. This meant that Lionel didn't need to enter a zone to earn a Tier 9 black reward to go back. He just had to pay the appropriate fee. There were only two issues with this. First, he needed Earth's coordinates. This was simple enough, he could just ask the dictionary about it. The second issue is much harder to deal with, he had to actually be allowed to leave. Even though no one had ever said anything about his travel being restricted, the teleportation pads were still owned by the cities. Just like he could be rejected from entering their hotels, he would be stopped from using their other services as well. As for why people who apparently couldn't stand his guts would stop him from leaving, that had an explanation as well. No one wanted to be complicit in the escape of a suspicious entity. There was no way they'd help him. The guards laughed amongst one another. Still, who do you think those fugitives they're looking for are? The guards fell into silence. All of them looked toward the rookie that asked such a stupid question as though they couldn't wait to skin him alive. The rookie, seemingly realizing he said something wrong, lowered his head. He didn't even mumble an apology, hoping that no one acknowledged what he had just asked. They all knew that Terrain was currently in a state of turmoil, a crossroads of sorts. Some wanted to ensure their world reached the fifth dimension while others felt that doing such a thing was useless. As though the internal conflict wasn't bad enough, there were people pulling strings from the background, and it could be said that those who were pulling these strings were quite invested in ensuring that Terrain abandoned its chances of becoming a fifth-dimensional world. Lionel found the sudden silence of the guards to be quite interesting. It seemed as though this was another open secret everyone was aware of but didn't dare to speak of. Anyway, the rookie tried to change the subject. I heard that another power suffered a loss at the hands of the sword monstress. The guards looked at the rookie weirdly. What kind of name is that supposed to be? How am I supposed to know? I'm not the one that came up with the name. I hear she's a woman and a monster, so they call her the monstress. They say she's built and looks like a gorilla and wields a 3-meter-long sword, thus sword monstress. The guards looked at one another, all simultaneously sent a kick toward the rookie. What a lame story. Lionel shook his head and left. They weren't talking about anything he was interested in any longer. A long while later, the road Lionel traveled along began to grow less and less well-kept. It slowly became narrower and less paved. Soon, weeds and grasses began to spring up all along it. By now, Lionel had left the range of the city. Anyone who was hoping to reach the city gates within the next half hour before closing had long since passed him by. It was safe to say that he was fairly alone at this point. Soon, the flat land began to turn into a forest that quickly grew in density. After reaching this point, Lionel entered a state of high alert. On his way here, he had crossed two groups heading toward the city. But both of them had had individuals he felt could squash him like a bug. If it wasn't for his rags and his weakness, there was no telling if he would have been robbed and killed or not. This told him two things. First, this meant the fourth dimension was a completely different animal. Lionel didn't know why he didn't feel the pressure of this world, but he knew that he couldn't underestimate it just because of this. Second, Lionel realized that having such powerful people in your midst was practically a necessity if he wanted to travel through this world. Of course, Lionel had one advantage, his internal sight. He could trust it in most cases and dodge danger before he even reached it. After crystallizing his spirit pressure, he could see up to half a kilometer away even in this fourth-dimensional world. Back on Earth, his range was easily over a kilometer. Lionel could only hope that a half-kilometer and his instincts were enough to keep him safe. After he traveled a decent enough depth, Lionel began to sink into the ground. It takes more force now. Lionel frowned, but he could only keep pouring his force out. He had already been aware that multiple things would be more difficult after coming to a fourth-dimensional world. He could only accept it. Soon, Lionel's head had disappeared from the surface, completely vanishing. He had one main goal in mind. He had to finish his force crystallization and complete his 10th node. Only then would he had some more assurance in staying in this backwards world. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.